This is something scary that happened to me on New Year's Eve of 2013. That night, I accompanied a few friends to a restaurant and club downtown for a New Year's party. I had been feeling a little under the weather all day, but met them at the club regardless. Around 15 till midnight, I couldn't kid myself any longer and let them know I was heading home. The parking lot was very dark, so I pulled a small flashlight out that I carried with me. I usually kept it in my pocket and used it to light my path. As I turned the corner of the building, I caught notice of noise off to my left between two parked cars. When I reached the area, I shone my light onto the location of the noise and saw a man crouched over on the ground. I asked him if he needed any help with something, partly from suspicion, and he said yes. He claimed he had dropped his keys and could not find them in the dark, and asked if I could shine my light over to where he was to help them. Everything about the situation seemed legit, so I put my fears aside and began helping him. I crouched down next to him while he searched the area under the car. A few minutes passed and we were unable to locate the keys. Switching places with the man, I aimed the beam further and under the car. Doing this caused me to lean down further than I had to at that point. This is when I felt a hard crack against the back of my head. I remember the feeling of my face hitting the pavement, but that was all for a moment. I was probably only unconscious for a few seconds because I began waking up while I was being flipped over on my back. When my eyes opened, I saw a guy I did not recognize going through my pockets. He just pulled my wallet out of my back pocket and handed it to the other guy, the one I had been helping. Then, I watched as he pulled out my pocket knife out of my front right pocket and flicked it open. It had one of those assisted openings that makes it a little bit easier to open up real quick, kind of like a switchblade. He began waving it around in my face and asked me what my plans were for it. It was not a big knife or anything. The blade was maybe 3 inches long, and I carried it to use as a daily tool, like opening boxes at work and stuff like that. I had never viewed it as a real weapon until that moment. It was not big, but it was sharp enough to cut my throat. I could not say anything back to him. Even though I was now fully awake, I was too afraid to do anything. He continued waving it around and laughing. Fortunately for me, a group of men and women had just arrived and noticed what was going on. One of the men yelled out, "Hey, what are you dudes doing to him?" They must have been afraid of the number of people in the group and ran off down the street. A couple of the guys checked me out to make sure I was okay while the others called 911. The first responders arrived a few minutes later, and I went to the ER in the meat wagon. I was happy to hear I only had a slight concussion and would be allowed to go home later that morning. A female in the group had been kind enough to go into the club and tell my friends what had happened, and they arrived soon after I did. They cut me loose with nothing more than a headache. A few hours later, I got a ride home. I only spoke to the police briefly that night to give them a report, but it was not until the following day when I got any information. My knife had been found across the parking lot from where I had been assaulted, but I never got it back because it was quote-unquote evidence in an open investigation. They had also found my wallet down the street from the club, but nothing was in it. The iPhone I was carrying at the time never surfaced, but I had insurance on it and got another one. I still have no idea where the flashlight went to, and the 2 guys that assaulted me still have not been found, and I do not expect they ever will be. The incident had me pretty messed up for a few years, but I eventually realized I was still alive and that was the most important thing. Despite this, I will probably never be able to come to the assistance of another person I do not know without being very afraid. Just to be safe, I think I will mind my own business from now on. Better safe than sorry, you know? One little phone call can change a life. But for Karen Faulkner, 3 telephone calls changed her life in a way she will never, ever forget. 2 of the 3 were made within just a couple of hours of each other on the 1st of January, 1993. The first was from her mother, informing her that her older sister had gone missing after celebrating at a New Year's Eve party. The second was even worse news. The call came from her father, telling her a body had been found. Karen's sister Kimberly had been murdered. Over the next 18 years, Karen and the Forkner family had grieved, come to terms with their loss, and eventually put it behind them. Until one fateful day, when the phone rang. The story of Kimberly Jean Duncan's murder is as random as it is horrific. She was a young woman, just 30 years of age. She was married with 2 young children in Aloha, northeast Portland. She and her husband had been invited to a New Year's party. However, Duncan went alone because her husband had picked up a back injury and was immobilized with extreme pain. But as the night crawled into the wee hours of the morning, Kimberly had failed to arrive long after she was due to arrive home. Naturally, her husband began to grow irritated. It was not unusual for her to be a little bit late, due to drunken revelry and whatnot, but after hours and hours of unexplained absence, her husband went from irritable to downright worried. He grabbed his cell phone and began to call a few mutual friends who he knew would also be at the party. Eventually one answered, but his question on his wife's whereabouts were met with confusion. She had left the party hours before, sober as a judge, to get home for the time she had promised. Meanwhile, a stationary vehicle was spotted by a member of the public, parked in a neighborhood not too far from where Kim had been attending the New Year's Eve party. Initially, the person who spotted it guessed that the figure that lay motionless behind the steering wheel was just too drunk to drive and decided to sleep it off. But when the car was still there the following morning, they called the police. When the cops arrived, they discovered the slumped figure was dead. They had been shot once in the head at close range. Officers fished around the vehicle for some form of ID. When they found some, the name on the card was Kimberly Jean Duncan. After an impromptu autopsy, Karen Forkner learned that her recently deceased sister had traces of narcotics in her bloodstream. This led local police to theorize that she could have been involved with violent drug dealers. That fact left Karen highly conflicted. Given that Kim had dabbled with drugs in high school, even struggled with addiction at one point, but had recently been telling her family that she was clean and sober. Despite her troubled past, Karen figured the best way to honor her sister would be to keep her memory alive. She needed to figure out what happened to her, and more importantly, who killed her. But when she called the cold case homicide unit to find out where the case stood, she discovered they had absolutely nothing. They also had a caseload of 273 investigations, with just 3 full-time detectives. Karen could do the math. They were hideously overloaded with work. Months later, Karen called again. Same status. She called again. Within the unit, she became known as a bit of a pest. On one call, however, she reached a detective newly assigned to cold cases. He told Karen to call whenever she wanted, and he would keep her informed of any developments. This kind of personal touch meant a lot to her. Her sister had been a living, breathing person, not an item that had been stolen or a piece of property that had been damaged. It was during one of these conversations with the new officer that she learned about a certain deck of playing cards. The unit sergeant had just come back from a national police convention, where he had learned that some police agencies were using the cards to solve cold case murders. Each card featured the victim's face, some details, and a number to call. The cards were distributed to jails and prisons with the hopes that an inmate might remember something. Forkner made it her mission to get her sister's case on one of those 52 cards. She called, and she pestered, and she called again. When the first deck of cards was placed in Oregon's institutions, Duncan's case was featured on the 10 of diamonds. 2 years later, an inmate was playing cards in Oregon Penitentiary. This inmate held the 10 of diamonds in his hand. He read about the case, and by pure coincidence, something about it sounded strangely familiar to him. If he could provide the authorities with pertinent information, it could be a bargaining chip on his case. Authorities agreed to work with him. On pretense, they moved the man to a hospital, had him wear an undercover wire, and listened as he called his old friend to come see him. In the hospital room, he got his friend to talk about the case. Days later, authorities made an arrest. That is when Karen Forkner received the third phone call. On the 15th of June 2010, Karen was driving on the freeway when her cell phone rang. The cold case detective told her to get her family together and come right away. "We walked into a room and everyone was standing and waiting for us," she said. The original detective who had worked the case was retired, but he was there. He had tears in his eyes. The family was told at 8:20 a.m. that very morning authorities had arrested Brad Richard Ballantyne, a 37-year-old, in connection with the murder. More than a year later, on Thursday, July 7th, Ballantyne pleaded guilty. The family knew who, but not why. Before sentencing, Ballantyne agreed to meet with the family in a jury room on the 5th floor of the Multnomah County Courthouse. "After all these years, we had the chance to confront him," Forkner said. "He said he had seen my sister at the store when she was leaving after getting some cigarettes. She pulled something out of her pocket, and some money fell on the ground. He wanted to rob her. Brad Ballantyne wanted to get her out of sight, so he flirted with her and asked her to get in her car and followed him up the street. She was probably drunk," Forkner said. "So she did. Ballantyne parked his car in front of hers. He came back to Duncan's car. He said she got mad," Forkner related. "I think she must have realized something was wrong. He said she was disrespectful. He walked back to his car and got a gun. He came back and shot her. He fled with $68. I'll tell you what I'll never forget," Forkner said. "He told us she never saw it coming." Karen's father died a year later. Her mother is still alive. "I wanted my parents to know what happened to their daughter," Karen had said. "I wanted them to know the killer had been caught. She'd be proud of me," Forkner said, admitting she still thinks of her sister often. "She would have been as tenacious as I was if it had been the other way around." This happened on New Year's Eve 2016 in Ixtapa, Mexico. "My family and I go there every year to spend the holidays since we own an apartment there, and it allows my dad to escape his work environment for a little bit. The apartment we own is an apartment complex that has 24 in total, divided into 4 towers. They all look the same and have a small terrace with a small hot tub in the corner. Since we have owned that apartment for a few years, my parents became close with a lot of the other residents, which created a nice environment to be during the holidays. Anyway, on the New Year's Eve, we were invited with many of the other residents to spend New Year's at one of their apartments. Around 35 people or so showed up, if I had to guess. The apartment is on the 4th floor of the building, and we arrived there at around 10 p.m., since many of us had had dinner before with my family and joined to celebrate the New Year for the rest of the night. At around 10:50 or 11 p.m., one of my mother's friends looked up to the sky and said she saw something rather strange. Many of the residents, myself included, shrugged it off at first and kept on talking. Within just a couple of minutes, though, more and more people started looking up. Once we saw the commotion, we got up and went outside to the terrace to join them and see what the fuss was all about. It was kind of strange at first, but I can describe it as if the stars were twinkling. We could see stars, but these were bunched up closer than usual, and they were twinkling intermittently in an unusual fashion. As we kept looking more and more, these stars kept showing up and twinkling. Some were just saying that they were stars, and we were staring at nothing. But that's when we saw the stars begin to move in the sky. They weren't just twinkling now. They were moving all about. At this point, we all started to freak out a little bit. I like to think we are not alone, and that there are paranormal forces out there, but this was truly the first time I had no idea what was going on, or what I was witnessing. There were too many to count, but we all agreed there was around 100 to 150 quote-unquote stars that were twinkling and moving in one section of the sky. It was like they were all joining together, and once they stopped, they continued to twinkle in an unnatural way. I just can't explain it. It's as if it was turning lights on and off, and not the slight dimness you would see when it's an actual star. Then this entire cluster moved across the sky and disappeared. We were all just staring with our mouths wide open. Many of us tried to record or take pictures, but nothing shows up on the phone cameras, especially that far away. The fact that it was 35 or so people witnessing it, and only about an hour after we got there, means that we definitely saw what we saw. No one was intoxicated to the point to where they could have imagined it. The most interesting part is that the son of the apartment owner said that the year before he talked to a guy that said he had seen something similar on New Year's Eve the year before. He said he listened to the story but shrugged it off as some guy ranting. My family and I continue to talk about it to this day. We immediately tried to investigate phenomena or events that could have caused it, and nothing has come up so far. I'm not sure if anybody listening to this show has any information on this, but I'd love to share it anyway and see if somebody could provide some type of insight. Sorry for the long story, but that was the most concise way I could explain it. I know some people say these stories are true for immersion, but believe me when I say this is 100% true. 3 of my friends and I were spending the night together on New Year's Eve about a year ago, and we decided we wanted to spend the night in a tent outside, really close to the woods. We were laughing and messing around, normal teenage things. Then, we heard this rustling outside in the leaves. Figuring it was just an animal or something, we shrugged it off. At this point, it was nearing midnight, and we had a flashlight on in the tent and we were blasting music. That is when all hell broke loose. We heard this chirping noise outside. When I say chirping, I do not mean it sounded like a bird or a raccoon, but this unearthly chirping that did not sound like any animal at all. In fear, we were about to be ambushed. I demanded my friends temporarily turn off the lights and the music. At first, they looked at me like I was crazy, but I strengthened my tone. Turn it all off, now! At this point, they knew I was serious, so they turned it all off and listened. There it was again, this unearthly chirping that did not sound like anything. My friends and I were dropping bricks, but I was a little bit braver than the rest of them. I had been taking karate for about 4 years, and I'm a very tall female capable of taking down a grown man. So I figured I could take whatever was out there, or at least I could carry one of my friends if we had to run away. They all tried to play it cool and said it must have been one of those screamer firework things, but I could tell they were all soiling themselves. We carried on screwing around for a few more minutes, desperately trying to forget about the screech chirping thing outside. Then we heard it again. This time, though, much closer to our tent. This was the first time I could properly hear it. When it made a clearer sound, reality drop-kicked me in the stomach. It was big, and it was almost right outside of our tent. My friends and I were about to freak out. So, they started asking me questions as to what I thought it was. I was the friend who was into all things paranormal, and I guess you could still say I am. But I have never been a paranoid person. So, they asked me. I told them, just as a suggestion, that it could be a skinwalker or a fleshgate, because I read somewhere that they like to mock the voices of your friends and like to emit strange noises. I only said this because I thought that might help them get over the scream chirp thing, but I think they were really scared. We heard it again. At this point, everyone was dropping bricks again, and one of them eventually called her older brother to come and hang out with us for a while. While he was there, just our luck, We could not hear the chirp screech anymore. Of course. We hung out with him for a while until we all decided to go on a walk with him. The walk was fun, and my friends were terrified because we were walking around in the pitch black. Oddly, maybe this is strange on my part, but I have always liked the dark. As it was so vast and mysterious, I was also low-key hoping we would find the flesh gate so my friends would stop acting like stuck-up little turds that weren't quote-unquote scared because I could see they were crapping themselves. Part of me was also pretty scared to see what would happen if we stumbled across a flesh gate. But her older brother had a knife with him, and I was prepared to stab it if he were not. Fast forward into the night. We were blasting music again and playing with a multicolored strobe light. Probably not the best way to avoid being jumped in the middle of the night. Now that I think about it, it was probably downright stupid to have it at all. My friend's brother had left us his knife in case we heard anything strange that night. It made us feel more comfortable. My friends all decided that I was the only one who would be brave enough to stab someone or something if it came down to it, so I oversaw holding the 6-inch knife all night. Thankfully, it was in a sheath, because despite my training, I am quite clumsy, especially this late into the night. I could not help taking the knife out of the sheath because it was so interesting and absolutely beautiful. There it was again. The same chirp screech. I unzipped the tent to look, knife drawn, and heard something scurry away quickly into the woods. Since my friends did not hear it, I left it alone and said nothing. Everything was fine for the rest of the night. That is, until I was the only one awake. I heard this horrible scream howl, much more blood-curdling than the chirps. It kept getting closer to the tent, and then backing away like it somehow knew I was the only one awake. It circled us, made itself sound more distant than it really was, then came back with another howl. One of my friends briefly awoke and told me it was probably someone having a party, but I could tell she was just saying that so she could get to sleep. Me, however, I could go for 3 days straight without having to sleep. I was perfectly fine without sleep unless I had a long day of school the next day or something. Believe me, when I say I did not let my guard down once, I listened to this thing in the location the cries took place. I was not about to let some flesh gate or whatever this thing was come and kill my friends and me on a night that was supposed to be fun. It's New Year's. We're not supposed to be scared, we're supposed to have fun. I drew the knife a few times and practiced slashing the air in case it attacked. But luckily, it never did. The thing just spent hours taunting me, trying to draw me out. I was incredibly tempted to run out there just to get a look at it, but I knew that is exactly what it wanted. Wanting for me to not be in a group so it could pick me off. There was no way, in frozen hell, I would let it anywhere near my friends. The older brother had left to go to a friend's house later that night as well, and the friend we were all staying with lived with her grandma. There was no strong men around. I lived around the neighborhood and both my mom and dad were home. My dad is a big guy, standing at 6'2", and strong as hell, but it would be too far to run. I could not go out there to see what it was even if I wanted to. Even though I am fast, I was weak considering how late it was, and I would become this thing's prey easily. Knowing this, I just laid back, knife at the ready, listening in absolute horror. You do not know what true vulnerability is until you are on the outskirts of the woods in a tent with 3 lives in your hands, while some paranormal creature is hunting you, teasing you, and you only have one close combat weapon that you are not even certain will put a scratch on it. I sat there in silence until around 6 in the morning, when I was certain that it had stopped. I could not take it anymore. The thing had driven me absolutely insane. My work there was done, and I was certain it was gone. I left the knife on my pillow, and a note that said I went home. I was not dead, so I could reassure my friends when they woke up later. I began to walk to my house, and to my house the streets were poorly illuminated by street lamps. There were not that many, leaving a ton of dark spaces that I could not see even if I tried. To make matters 10 times worse, My glasses were smudged, and I could barely see a thing out of them. I knew it was better to my advantage if I kept them on, though, because I am blind as a bat. I scanned my surroundings my whole way there, keeping my eyes on every direction this thing could attack from. The thing was probably just waiting to get me alone, but I was not going to let it do anything to me. When I finally got to my house, the door was unlocked to my relief, so I could get in without my parents hearing me. Unfortunately, this was 5 in the morning, and as I mentioned before, clumsy as ever, I bumped into everything as I tried to navigate myself to my room, where I forced myself to go to sleep. After that, when asked, my friends would say it was a screamer firework or some animal, but I can tell they were just too scared to really face the reality. I tried to make sense of it, but I just could not. I knew what I heard, and I knew it was much worse than they could have imagined. They probably thought I mentioned fleshgates and skinwalkers just to scare them, but I honestly believe it was one of the two. Nothing like this has ever happened to me again, but there is a reason we have not been sleeping outside for quite a long time. This is probably the weirdest experience that has ever happened to me. This is causing a lot of trauma in my life and has made it very difficult for me to date like a normal person. Let me give you some background. I am a 23-year-old woman, and I live in a small town in rural Mississippi. I know everyone in the town, and they all know me. I never quite fit in with the small town scene. It was not that I was against it or anything, but there was just not anyone I really clicked with. I had lots of friends, but I was still completely alone for as long as I can remember. A couple of years ago, I started dating a guy who I met on Tinder. He was from a couple of towns over and was not the best looking guy in the world, but I do not let something like that stop me. I just wanted to know if he was nice and compatible with me. So we went on a couple of dates. It did not go horribly, I guess. He was a perfect gentleman, and every time, he never pressured me into doing anything that I did not feel comfortable with, which I really appreciate. So after about 3 weeks of casual dates here and there, we made the decision that we really had something here. We had both deleted our Tinder accounts together and started spending more time with each other. Honestly, I thought we had a real chance of having a lasting relationship. But as time went by, I noticed that he was weird. And not the I watch conspiracy theory documentaries on Netflix kind of weird. I mean, I saw some real signs of various mental illnesses. Some of them include narcissistic personality disorder, bipolar disorder, with some extreme episodes of anxiety and depression, and he would eventually go insane over some of these things that stressed him out. So, one of the times that he got into these episodes was when his uncle was going to visit. His parents asked him to sleep on the couch so his uncle could sleep in his bed. He had a literal mental breakdown. I remember me and him texting back and forth, and he was asking me if it was a good idea to physically attack him or start a fight. A few more incidents like that, and I knew I had to end this relationship. As much as I want to help people, I really do not want to sacrifice my own well-being for the sake of helping anyone else. It was probably 3 or 4 weeks into our relationship that I made the decision. I asked him if he wanted to get some coffee, and he agreed. We broke up, and he took it rather well, which surprised me. I was expecting him to have a breakdown, and while he did look sad, he did not act inappropriately towards me at all. He had a solid frown on his face. Then he walked away. I felt bad for doing it, but that was the decision that I made, and I have to live with it. But it was for the best. Now we'll get into the weird part. In a couple of weeks that we had been dating, he had never been to my house and had no idea where I lived. That is going to be important to remember a little bit later on. We probably broke up around April or so, and it seems to be somewhere in that time frame at least. So, you can understand the terror that washed over my face when I saw his car parked in my driveway almost a year later. On Valentine's Day, it had been so long since I had last seen him. I did not even recognize his car at first. You can bet your rear end that I had my pistol with me ready to protect myself, especially because my parents were not home. Remember, I live in rural Mississippi. People do not just randomly show up at your house who live 2 towns away. It just does not happen like that. He got out of his car holding flowers. I could not believe it. What the heck is wrong with this guy, I thought. I walked up to him, making sure to keep my pistol out of sight. I did not want to alarm him, but I was ready to defend myself if need be. His face looked strange. He looked like he had not slept in days. He also looked like he was really struggling and uncomfortable. I asked him what he was doing here after we just kind of looked at each other for about a minute. Then he just said, "Will you be my Valentine?" The moment he began to speak, I knew he was intoxicated, and it honestly frightens me. I had heard too many horror stories that start out exactly this way. I pulled my gun out and pointed at him. I screamed, "No, go the hell home and never come back." He genuinely seemed startled at the sight of the gun. Then he got into his car and drove away. But as he ran, I noticed he dropped something metal in a hurry. It must have been just barely nudged into his pocket. After he had sped off, I waited for a few minutes just to make sure he was gone. Then I walked over toward the object he had dropped on the floor. I could not make it out at first because of the darkness. I picked it up and put it under my phone light. I was mortified. It was a pair of metal handcuffs. Just imagine how much he must have thought about me. Just imagine how much time he has thought about me. That he waited all this time, building up the nerve to just randomly show up at my house with a pair of freaking handcuffs ready to do who knows what to me. It was honestly quite terrifying. I called the police and reported him for being a creep. They could not really do anything seeing as he did not commit a crime, so I made sure to tell my family and friends to watch out for him if they ever see his vehicle around. I just imagine how different my life would be if I had not been armed that night. I was all alone and my parents would not have been home for hours. There was a solid chance of him kidnapping me and me becoming someone you see on a true crime documentary. This has been a big reminder for me, and let it be a lesson for anyone listening right now. If you are defenseless and alone in the middle of nowhere, make sure that you have at least some way of protecting yourself, because I am sure I'm not the only girl in the world he is ever going to try this stunt on. It all started on the 7th of February. The small independent coffee shop I was working at decided to throw up a few decorations for Valentine's Day. So I and a few colleagues had spent pretty much our entire shift putting up pink and red bunting, writing romantic quotations around the edges of our blackboard menu, and other romantically themed stuff. It was a fun way to spend a shift, but as I clocked out and began the short walk back to my flat, I began to feel a slight pang of loneliness, knowing I would be single and alone on the day itself. I considered Tinder or Bumble to try to bag myself a date, but the chances of securing myself a boy that I genuinely liked over the next 7 days were slim to none. So I resigned myself to another Valentine's Day on my own. But when I got home to a pink envelope in my mailbox, I must admit that it brought a little smile to my face. A secret admirer, like something right out of the cheap romantic paperback. It might not be every girl's cup of tea, but to be honest, it really cheered me up, even if it was from a friend or the nice lady that lived in the ground floor flat. Only, when I opened the thing up, it just says, 7 days to go. No romantic message, no kisses or hearts, just those 3 words scrawled hastily onto the paper. It is then I realized there is nothing on the envelope or the paper it contained that confirmed it was addressed to me. No name, no address, nothing. I started to feel a tad silly, like what if it was not meant for me at all? What if someone had sent their little Valentine's card to the wrong person? I told myself I was just being silly, but kept the envelope and card as I walked upstairs to my flat and got on with my evening. I honestly think I had forgotten the whole thing by the next morning when I got up and set off to work again. But when I got home, there was a stark reminder that this was no mistake. Arriving back at my flat, I checked my mailbox to find yet another pink envelope inside. Not only that, but a small brown paper package was stuffed inside too. Again, I must admit to being kind of excited about the whole thing. There definitely had not been a mistake of address or anything. I mean, the person must have had to put all that stuff in there themselves. Maybe I really did have a secret admirer, and that Valentine's was about to become something out of a fairy tale. But as I opened the package, I knew something was not quite right. Inside was a small brown teddy bear, only it was not newly bought, nor had it been looked after very well in what was obviously a long and grubby existence. To be frank, it was filthy. The thing looked like it had not been washed in years, decades even. The fur was all grimy and matted together, and one of the glass eyes was missing, probably having been pulled out by a child some years before. The note inside the envelope was pretty much the same as the last one, only this time it read, 6 days to go. That is about the time I realized that whoever was sending these was not exactly all there, and what had previously been some kind of giddy excitement turned into nervous anticipation. The more I let my mind dwell on it, the more and more frightened I became. This was not going to be some dream romance. In fact, it was more likely going to be the opposite. I told my friend at work about the whole thing, and they seemed to take it much more seriously than I had. They told me I obviously had a stalker, and that even if this person was doing this stuff out of affection, it was still crossing several personal boundaries, and I should consider contacting the police. But what do I even tell them exactly? That I had a note addressed to no one, from no one, with no other details than I found them in my mailbox? Alright, it was not exactly the dream romantic gesture that I wanted, but I don't know. But at the same time, why cause someone the distress of calling the cops on them? That felt a bit cruel. But after returning home that evening to something else in my apartment, I did not feel so apprehensive about contacting them. I arrived home again that evening to find exactly what I expected in my mailbox. Another note. This time reading, yep, you guessed it, 5 days to go. I stormed up to my apartment, grabbed a piece of notebook paper and a Sharpie, and wrote out something along the lines of, "Whoever is leaving stuff in my mailbox, please stop." It was sweet at first, but now it's kind of creepy. No more, or I call the police. I tried not to come across as too rude or aggressive, but I also needed to make it clear that I really did not appreciate their unwanted attention. I taped the note to the front entrance of my apartment building before I went to bed, hoping whoever it was would get the message and just leave me alone. So, a little side note. I take a shower before bed every single night, without fail. I am also sort of a clean freak. I keep my bathroom pretty much spotless, so as I finish getting washed, something small catches my eye. Something that might not even gain the attention of most people. But to me, it stuck out like a sore thumb. A flash of color in what is an otherwise pristine white bathroom, on the window ledge, was a tiny, glassy dome shape that just sat there on its own. I approached it curiously, peering down at it for a moment before I completely freaked out and ran out of the bathroom and called the cops. It was a small, glass eye, a minuscule amount of fabric woven into the back of it. I recognized it almost instantly as the missing eye from the teddy bear that I would have found in my freaking mailbox. While I was on the phone with the police, I realized a few things about my prospective Valentine. As I said, I get a shower every evening before bed. I like hot showers, the steamier the better, so naturally the bathroom window spends a lot of time ajar to let out the moisture. Whoever managed to put that glass eye on my bathroom window ledge had known about my evening routine. They had obviously been watching me for long enough to work out that they knew the exact time to place that thing there so I would see it. But it was their method that really creeped me out. The way they had used the small, Teddy's eye to tell me in so many words that they were watching me. I swapped the note out I had written for one that simply said, "The police have been contacted, leave me alone." And leave me alone they did. But the whole thing had a serious effect on my psyche for a long time afterward. Sometimes I would find myself staring at someone in the coffee shop or someone walking past my flat, wondering if it were them, if one day they would come back, and maybe one day they would look over at me and smile, and I would just know they'd not given up just yet. So I and my boyfriend were fans of nautical history. So we decided to spend our Valentine's Day in 2007 on the Queen Mary. As I'm sure most of you are aware, it is reported to be haunted. That was also kind of the appeal to us, but mostly we both have a bachelor's in European history, so it is cool to just go there in general. Anyway, we got a historical suite, meaning it was most likely one of the ones that was there on the original ship when it was commissioned, aside from an old TV. The first night, which was Valentine's Day, we stayed there. We both woke up to what sounded like drawers in the built-in dresser being opened and slammed shut repeatedly. We are both not the types to freak out and run, but I cannot really say we were both so low-key that we just acknowledged it. Eventually, we made sure that we were both okay and went back to sleep. Maybe because it was truly alarming at the time, maybe we just trusted that if we were both okay, then everything was okay. I do not know, but we were pretty creeped out. At that time, though, we did not know the history of the room. The next day, we went on a ghost tour. It turns out, we were sleeping in the second most haunted room on the ship. The room next door was Churchill's suite, where he planned battles during World War II. While we did not experience the cigar smoke or smell that many have reported staying in that room, it was still interesting that without knowing our room was even haunted, we experienced hauntings. We had some weird camera malfunctions in the engine room as well. We also noticed a creepy or aggressive feeling in an old museum room on the ship, which we only found because we tried to get into an unlocked room on the ship. It honestly just felt like somebody was creeping behind our backs, but again, I have no real proof of anything. Thanks for sharing our story on your program, and I hope it was creepy enough for everybody who listened. I've been a fan of the paranormal for some time. I recently worked as a haunted tour guide in downtown Dallas, covering areas such as the Grassy Knoll, Texas School Book Department, etc. One of the locations I stopped at was the Hotel Lawrence, which has at least 4 documented murders, all occurring on the 10th floor, in rooms that you can still stay in. My girlfriend decided to get us a room for Valentine's Day, since it was such a big part of my life at the time. We checked in the hotel, and knew right away it was more of an antique hotel rather than a refurbished hotel from the past. The hotel took 10 minutes to arrive. Our room was a smoking room, and our TV was a tube TV with an antenna. We brought back food and booze. It was Valentine's Day after all. We proceeded to relax, play music, and enjoy our day. I tried to open a window, but it was locked. I tried revoking the lock and moving it around, but it just wouldn't open. We joked about it and continued our evening, heading out to eat later, coming home for more drinks and watching Ghost Adventures. In the morning we packed. I was beginning to feel stomach cramps, but disregarded it. As we began to head home, my stomach cramps turned to chills, a fever, and soon a headache from hell. I got home and laid down. That night I had to go to work at midnight. As I am in the shower, I realize I have these thin scratches all across my torso. There's 3 of them to be exact, 1 on each side of my stomach and 1 on my chest. For the next 2 days, I battled feelings of sickness, mostly stomach pain, like I had just been punched hard. My girlfriend and I argued almost every single night over the smallest of issues. I could not sleep either. I went around 3 days on about 4 hours of total sleep. The headache was so bad and constant, and the pull string on our center window blinds would always sway without anything going. There was no fan, no wind to make it move. Then, one day, it just all stopped. The pain, the arguing, the sleepless nights, everything. Almost at a sign of what could happen if I were to mock the paranormal again. Since then, I quit my haunted history tour and vowed never again to stay in a hotel that is haunted. I've had my warning. This was a few years back in high school, a little bit after Valentine's Day, that will make more sense with the story once I continue. My friend decided to come over and stay at my house for the night. Everything was going great. We were watching random stuff on my TV, and I'm pretty sure it was some sort of movie. We were both sitting on the floor, and the craziest thing happened. The balloons that my boyfriend at the time got me for Valentine's Day got pulled all the way to the ground out of nowhere, and then they just floated back up as something tugged it down. We were both really freaked out, so I decided to move to the other side of my friend and stay far away from the balloons and continued watching the movie. Maybe 10 to 15 minutes later, we heard tapping on my window. We were getting shaken up about everything going down, and we tried to calm each other down. There is no way someone could casually come tap on my window because I live on the 3rd floor. After calming each other down, we kept watching stuff on my TV, trying to ignore everything that was happening. Now, I know my mom said our house was haunted, but I never experienced things as crazy as that. We heard footsteps occasionally, and I would open my door to check if anyone were walking around, and no one ever was. It started to get late. It was almost 5:45 a.m., so we decided to try and lay down and get some rest, but something did not want us to. My friend was sleeping on the floor, so I gave her some blankets and some pillows to get comfortable. As we were laying down, we started to hear banging footsteps on my roof. We were terrified. I whispered to my friend, "Did you hear that?" And she replied, "Yes, but I'm gonna ignore it." So that is what I tried to do, but it would not stop, and it kept getting louder. So we made the brave decision to take our blankets and run all the way down to the kitchen. The creepiest thing was that when we started leaving the room, the footsteps followed us all the way to the stairs, then stopped, and suddenly began walking away. We did not go back in my room for at least 2 hours. My mom checked out my room and told me it was probably a squirrel, but my friends and I both knew a squirrel could not have that kind of power to create such strong footsteps. I still hear things in my room, but nothing as terrifying as that. I hate telling this story, not only because of how traumatic it was for me, but because it shows my age. My therapist tells me I should learn to look for the positives in things, so the only way I really know how is by making light humor. This was the early 90s, and I was about 16 going on 17 working as a regular babysitter in our neighborhood. My parents had decided that the only way I was going to get a car would be if I was the one that saved up for the down payment. So every afternoon after school I would tutor kids or watch babies. Whatever I could do to earn a few extra bucks. There was one couple, the Moores, that always paid exceptionally well, and on Valentine's Day they had a special request for me to watch both their 6-year-old and their 10-year-old so they could go enjoy a romantic evening together. "We will be back by 8, they said, and gave me about $50 just for ordering pizza, renting movies, and whatever the kids wanted to do. I asked them both what they wanted, and they both chimed in with a request to go to the local video rental store. I knew that Blockbuster was not extremely far, but I insisted that I did not want to do that until I got confirmation from their mom. This being the age before everyone had cell phones, I had to look up the phone number in an actual phone book and call the restaurant they were at. Those two boys were so eager to hear a yes from their mom I thought they might explode from excitement. It took about 15 minutes for me to finally get in touch with their mom, who seemed a little frazzled that the only reason I was calling was so that we could go to Blockbuster. "Yeah, that's fine, just do not spend all their money, and nothing rated R," she responded. When I told them, both boys squealed and ran to get their jackets. We left the house before it got dark and made it to the rental store in less than 10 minutes. Not surprisingly, it was empty save for the cashier and maybe 1 or 2 other customers. "Go and pick out whatever you want," I told them as I grabbed some candy bars and popcorn. The oldest came back first with a VHS of some Disney sequel and asked if this was okay. I told him yes, and then asked where his brother was, only for him to be surprised that I did not know. Both of us went down the aisles looking for him, and for a split second I got scared thinking he decided to play some terrible prank and run off. Finally, though, I saw him standing near the edge of an aisle, talking to a tall, lanky man wearing a trench coat. As soon as I saw this guy, I got a weird vibe and grabbed the younger boy's hand. "Sorry, I hope he wasn't bothering you. I nervously told the stranger. He smelled funny, as if he had not taken a bath in a while. He had this weird, crazy look in his eyes that told me he was trouble. I just had a feeling. I desperately wanted to be wrong about it, so I yanked the kid away and berated him as we made our way towards the cashier. "What were you telling him anyway?" I asked. "Just that we were renting some movies and that we were home alone," the kid said innocently. I couldn't tell you why, but alarm bells did not go off in my brain right away. But I guess I was too busy paying for the movies and dragging them out of the store. When we were walking back toward the house, it finally registered what he told me. "Did the man ask you if you were alone?" I asked. My heart was starting to beat a little faster, but I did not want the kids to think I was worried. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw someone following us. "Yeah, he seemed friendly, asked a lot of questions about me," the younger boy responded. I picked up the pace and told them we need to hurry back to their house. I was positive now that we were being followed. I remember I looked back several times to see where this man was, but every time it felt like it was just barely out of sight. He was a master of stealth. Once I was inside their house, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I chided the kid for being so stupid. "Don't ever talk to strangers. That man could have done some serious harm to you." I remember thinking I should punish them by having them go to bed early, but I had no idea how right I would be about that. I glanced out the windows to see if I could spot him, and calming down, I went ahead and let them pick a movie. I was also trying to convince myself my paranoia had just been that. Less than 10 minutes later, we were watching the Angels in the Outfield movie. I heard a knock at the door, and that made me realize maybe I had not been cautious enough. I went to the front and peeked through the blinds, curious to see that no one was outside. My heart was pounding now as I thought I saw the man in the trench coat standing over near the bushes. I immediately told the boys to pull the blinds closed and then to turn off the lights. Next, I started to hear this stranger banging on the windows with what sounded like a stick. Was he just trying to frighten us? If so, he was doing a stellar job because I was terrified. "Turn off the TV for now. Let's go to the bedroom," I said. I remembered that the Moores had a house phone up in their master suite, so I was calmly trying to herd the kids there as this wacko kept rattling against the outside of the house. These kids were quite scared now, especially the youngest. He was crying. "Be quiet. Don't be scared," I told him. As we ran up to the bedroom, I told them both to stay as quiet as they could as I reached for the phone, only to find the line was disconnected. This is the moment when a real sense of panic and dread was starting to overwhelm me. It was just past 6:30, meaning their parents would not be home for at least another 45 minutes, and now the phone lines are down. I was positive that this stranger was going to try and break in and do us harm. Still, I insisted that they needed to remain quiet and calm. I got the older one to assist me in moving furniture to the front door as a blockade, just in case this guy broke in. It is a good thing I did, because 20 minutes later, I heard the shattering of glass and realized that's exactly what he planned to do. I told them both not to make a sound as I tried to listen where the stranger was. The one thing about the whole experience I will never forget is that the stranger started to whistle for us, like he was looking for a dog. It was loud and sharp. It was an insistent whistle, and he kept saying, "Here, boy. Here, boy. Come here, boy." I swear I've never been more scared in my life, and I ordered the boys to hide under the bed as the footsteps came up the stairs. I was sure we were about to die. It happened just like a horror movie, too. He was standing outside the door because I could see the silhouette of his shadow peeking under the master bedroom door. Then, the blockade of furniture started to rattle as I heard him fiddle with it. He shook it violently for a while, but to no success. Then another long, indescribably quiet moment. I thought maybe he had given up. The kids were trying their best not to squeal or scream or even cry, but it was so hard to be perfectly still. At any second, I knew he was going to be back. Then, he slammed his body against the door, and it came slightly ajar. I remember jumping and holding the boys closer as he did it again, and then again, until at last he could squeeze in past the wedged furniture. All I could see was his shoes, leather boots that looked coated in mud. He walked slowly over to the bed and sat down, perhaps puzzling over where we were. He started whistling again, and I had to cover the younger boy's mouth as he let a leash fall over the ledge of the bed. Did he know where we were? What sort of weird fetish was this supposed to be? He walked around the room, moving to the closet first and checking for us there. Then we heard the garage door downstairs. I have never been so happy. Immediately the stranger ran down and I heard shouts of alarm as Mr. Moore likely saw him escape. A few seconds later, Mrs. Moore was in the bedroom frantically searching for us and calling out for her children. I crawled out first and helped the youngest get out as she grabbed him and hugged him as tight as possible. Downstairs, Mr. Moore was trying to get the landline again to connect the cops, but it did not work. Honestly, I thought the crazy guy was going to come back and do us harm, so I did not even want to step outside the house until my own parents came to pick me up. Mr. Moore told me that I was very brave and paid me extra for helping keep his kids safe. My parents also told me I had acted swiftly and decisively, and it could have turned out a lot worse. But I did not feel immensely proud. I had trouble sleeping for a week or so after. Any sound of a dog barking or a whistle would trigger the memory and make me want to curl up in a ball and hide. I can honestly only share it now after all these years, thanks to a bit of therapy. Sometimes I do think about what could have happened. Still though, if those parents had not shown up early, he would have harmed us or probably killed us. The cops never did catch whoever that guy was, so I guess we will never know. Except at least I know I stopped babysitting for the upper class after that. So this happened when I was 12. I'm now 21 years old now. My mom had just finished photography school, so she was giving her first photo expo in a bar in the most centric part of town. It was kind of far from where I lived at the time, so it was also my first night out in a bar. The thing was, my mom did not realize that it was also St. Patrick's Day, so the place was packed with drunk 20-year-olds. I knew I was going to get bored, so I brought my then best friend along with me, who was the same age. So, sometime around 1 a.m., we were drinking Coke in the bar of the complex when 3 guys approached us. They start talking to us, making trivial conversation. Nothing weird at first. We, innocent little girls, thought they were just being nice. Then they started asking some rather odd questions. They were asking us what we were drinking, how old we were, our names, and where we lived. We told them that we were both 12, and they seemingly got very excited. So they start complimenting us a lot more all of a sudden, saying that we looked older, 21 at least, and we easily did not. We looked 15 at the most. They were telling us that we had women's bodies and were pretty for our age, and insisting on buying us drinks and taking us dancing. There was a dancing floor on the upper level. Now, I remember feeling flattered, but also scared and anxious. I had just had my first kiss like a month ago, so the idea of dancing with some older guy made me very anxious. My friend wanted to go with them. I got close to her and whispered that they were making me nervous. That is when I noticed my dad looking our way. When we got to him, he asked us who those guys were, and I just told him they asked us if the seats were taken, because I thought he would be mad if they were flirting with us. The night went on, and at approximately 3 a.m., my friend and I went out to hang out in the car, because it was much quieter out there. As we got in the car, we heard 2 guys fighting. One of them was the same guy who was talking to me. I'll just call him the pervert. I don't know where the other 2 had gone at that point. The other guy takes a bottle and breaks it on the pervert's head, knocking him out. There was blood everywhere, and the guy was on the floor bleeding, but I don't think he was dead or anything. The police came and got him, and arrested the 2 of them eventually. Finally, my parents got in the car with us, and they told us that the pervert had been insisting and touching the other guy's girlfriend against her will. We went home, and we never heard about those guys ever again. It is March 17th, 2019, St. Patrick's Day, in Cooktown, County Tyrone, United Kingdom. 17-year-old Lauren Bullock is getting ready to go to a party. She and her group of friends had spent their entire school day in increasing levels of excitement, swapping ideas of what to wear, exchanging rumors on who would and would not be attending, and most importantly, scheming on how to get their hands on the most quintessential of all St. Patrick's Day amenities: booze. No Paddy's Day party is complete without an unhealthy quantity of the demon drink, as any self-respecting Irishman will tell you. And for the underage Lauren, buying alcohol would be as easy as putting on a little extra makeup and standing on her tippy toes at the counter. After all, without the telltale school tie, extraordinarily little separates the appearance of a student and a fledgling office worker. Lauren and her friends finished their studies for the day before congregating in one of their parents' houses to prepare for the night's festivities. Outfits were road-tested, makeup applied, and the girls even sampled a little of their alcohol haul to get healthy pre-drunk before they departed. When the time came, they piled into a waiting taxicab, which drove them a few miles down the road to Greenvale Hotel. The sight that greeted them was one of utter chaos. The Greenvale Hotel on the outskirts of Cookstown had decided to throw a Paddy's Day dry disco for the local youth. Underage drinking is a huge problem in the UK in general, let alone in Northern Ireland, where alcohol is seen as a staunch tradition, even a rite of passage if you will. If parents knew where their children were on one of the rowdiest nights of the year, it belayed their fears, even if they understood how inevitable it was that someone would get their hands on alcohol. The popularity of such an event would be evident to Lauren and her friends upon their arrival at the Greenvale place. For outside the venue, that had a maximum capacity of just 100 or so, at least 500 to 600 excitable Irish young people had assembled and were waiting to be allowed inside. Such a ruckus scene might have been off-putting to other group of girls, but not Lauren and her friends. They found the huge gathering of their peers to be intensely exciting and attractive. Rural Ireland can be an extremely tedious place to live for a young person, lacking in all the adventure and attractions of the big city. So any opportunity to mingle with large groups of their peers outside of school hours is something very few Irish teenagers can pass up. Lauren and her friends climbed out of the taxi into a cold and windy evening to socialize with all of their friends and make a few new ones in the process. Meanwhile, inside the Greenvale Hotel, the management team is in a quandary. They knew all too well that there were way too many youths outside, and that not all of them could be let into the venue. However, St. Patrick's Day was a serious earner for the hotel. After a traditionally quiet January and February, St. Paddy's Day always kick-started the local community and economy in a big way. To limit their patrons during such an event would surely be inviting financial ruin, but something had to be done to avoid disappointing more than half of the young people that gathered outside. The general manager of the venue made the decision to go outside to address the waiting revelers. He told them in no uncertain terms that Greenvale simply did not have the facilities to accommodate so many of them, and some of them would have to go home disappointed. He then asked all the youth to form an orderly queue at the entrance, where staff would take their entrance fee and stamp their hands with black ink to verify them. That is when things started to go very wrong. As I previously mentioned, a long-standing tradition in the UK and elsewhere is to imbibe alcohol before arrival at a pub, club, or party, to get a head start and to save a little money. The same applied to the gathering of underage youths inside the Greenvale that night. So instead of doing as they were asked and forming an orderly queue at the entranceway, what started calmly had soon descended into a chaotic mess of shoving, shouting, and fighting. Hotel staff pleaded with the drunken crowds to calm themselves, but their cries were barely heard over the throngs of barking teenagers, some who had begun to shove their peers toward the waiting line. Lauren was one of those who had rushed the queue up first and began to feel herself being trapped against one of the Greenvale's outer walls. She tried to push back, to give herself a little personal space, but it was impossible. No matter how hard she and her friends shoved back, the crowd did not seem to disperse or diffuse. It was not long before neither Lauren nor her friends could move. Their arms were trapped by their sides, their bodies squeezed and compressed until some began to complain about feeling faint. Lauren was being crushed against the brick wall, finding it harder and harder to breathe as the crowds formed tighter and tighter around her. At one point, she saw a young man with glasses so pale he almost was white as a sheet, collapsed from the lack of oxygen available to him. This was barely noticed by the pushing crowds, who simply walked over and stepped on the unconscious boy, crushing him to death beneath their feet with nothing else in their minds but the desire to drink, dance, and flirt. With the very last of her strength, Lauren began to shout and yell.
"My friends are on the ground! Move back! My friends have fainted! Move back! My friends can't breathe! Move back!"
Nothing. Not one bit of movement or compassion. In fact, one of the last things Lauren ever saw before she passed out was the sight of laughing, spotty-faced teenage boys amusing themselves by pushing the crowd towards the doors, trying to get them inside so that they could start drinking. A horrific sight to see in the moments before unconsciousness, but Lauren would not just be rendered unconscious. The crush at the Greenvale Hotel that night went on for about a half hour. By the time the crowd realized what was happening, it was far too late. Lauren, along with several other teenagers, had been suffocated in the crush. Nigel Ruddell, the medical director of Northern Ireland's ambulance service, told the BBC that the emergency crews who responded to a 999 call shortly before 9:30 p.m. encountered upsetting scenes. At this stage, everything points toward it being a tragic accident, and our hearts absolutely go out to the families of those involved and everybody who was caught up in this incident last night, he said. Yet the tragedy seems to have been painted by the media as a seemingly unavoidable one, an incident as sudden and shocking as a terror attack or a natural disaster. But there was nothing natural about the deaths at the Greenvale Hotel that night, as they had been entirely avoidable. In fact, the fact remains that poor planning, drug use, and youthful zeal had proved a deadly cocktail. And without admitting anything, things like that will continue to happen again and again.
For some context, I'm a female, and at the time I was 19 years old. I was living in a central flat with my older sister. We were out this one weekend night celebrating St. Patrick's Day. It was me, my sister, and a few friends. We started out having pints at an Irish pub, then soon we'd moved on to a popular hotel bar. I was a bit tipsy at this point, so I decided to switch to water as I had work really early the next morning. We were having a really great time, and nothing really seemed out of the ordinary, but I decided anyway that I'd go ahead and head home due to my early start the next day. Anyway, I said goodbye to my friends, and I headed out into the nice clear evening. I walked a couple of blocks, and I went to a 7-Eleven on the corner to go buy a bottle of juice. There's always some semi-sketchy types hanging around on that street corner. That's usually where cab drivers tend to hang around waiting for customers, so I didn't pay much attention to any of them. I exited the shop, then turned the corner to an empty street. I then hear footsteps behind me. I look behind, and it's a pretty big guy, seemingly advancing right on me. I lifted my phone from my pocket and dialed 911 without pressing the call button. I then crossed the street to see if he would follow me, which he immediately did. I was heading in a direction immediately away from the shops, and I couldn't turn around without ending up face to face with them. Oh shit. I turned on another street corner right towards my door. It's really important to note that this house didn't have a front door key. It was a 4-digit passcode that granted access to the building, and then you'd have to open your own door with your key. The only thing I can think of is, don't let him see the code. If he sees the code, you're dead. This type of sentence started pulsating in my mind, and I started running in stiletto heels. He too is picking up the pace, and he's running after me. At this point, I'm not really feeling anything. It was so strange. It was like I had the actions laid out in front of me. I had to outrun him and reach my door before he did. There was no option. As I made it to the door, I covered the keypad with my hand before hurriedly punching in the code. He didn't catch it. Nevertheless, though, he's trying to forcibly push his way in. I've often wondered how exactly I'd react in a situation like this. You never really know until you're actually exposed. Well, apparently I get angry. I started shouting at him to get the fuck away, etc. He responds with laughter, then saying,
"No way, you know I live here too."
So I ask him for the passcode and he's trying to laugh it off and keeps pushing me in. I remember that I still had a sturdy grip on my phone, and I'd showed him the screen where I'd keyed in 911 triumphantly. I kept shouting abuse and that he really needed to leave or I'd call. Thankfully, he got a terrified expression on his face and then ran. On shaky legs, I managed to get into the lift, into my flat, and then secured the door for what felt like 1,000 times. I called my sister at first. No answer. I called my boyfriend, panicking. He hadn't been out with us that night. He too was laughing it off. He told me that it was probably just some guy that fancied me and decided to fool around a bit. I wasn't convinced and I barely slept that night. I told my sister the next morning after she asked me about all those missed calls. My sister told me at that point that she got a really weird vibe from the guy sitting across the bar, that he was staring at us. We compared descriptions and they seemed to match. She didn't remember seeing him at all after I left. I still sometimes wonder if something serious could have happened, and just how strange it was that my mind fixated completely on the passcode.
Some living arrangements can be unusual to say the least, and renting on-site at a storage facility is quite different than living in a regular apartment. My uncommon living area connects to the storage facility by a long, dark, cold hallway from a door in what we would call our porch area, and every night I must walk past this door to get into my apartment. When my wife and I go to bed at the same time, I do not notice it. But when she goes to sleep before me, and the house is dark and quiet, acute anxiety grips me as I quickly patter down the hallway to my bedroom. Something about that doorway to the storage facility feels ominous. Always has. A small peephole is in the door, and sometimes I imagine looking through it at night, only to see something or someone in the hallway on the other side. One night last year, in the weeks leading up to St. Patrick's Day, strange events began to unfold. At first, we did not really notice anything too weird, mainly because of the place's customers are in and out of the facility at all hours of day and night. Not to mention the fact that there can just turn out to be some strange folks when all of this is said and done. Anyway, at first it was just like things like my toolbox going missing and reappearing broken, or a small pile of leaves being left in front of my wife's office door. We figured it was just bored teenagers, maybe even a drunk stumbling home from a speakeasy around the corner. But then, things were starting to get more odd. We awoke one morning with the bedroom windows open when we did not remember opening them the night before. A quick inventory of our belongings showed that nothing had been stolen. But when we filed a police report for what was apparently an attempted burglary, one night at around 4 a.m., our bedroom lights began wildly turning on and off, waking us up. Then it stopped just as quickly as it began. We put it down to electrical faultiness and made a mental note to call the landlord. But the very next morning, we found the bathroom mirror was shattered, and in the living room, all the furniture was stacked into a big pile. The night before St. Patrick's Day, I really did not want to be home alone. Rosa, my wife, had to work late. So unfortunately, I really did not have a choice. We were both on edge at this point from the events of the previous days and nights, and we were constantly snapping at each other from a lack of sleep. Thankfully, I had to work too and was able to get away from the apartment for a few hours, but I dreaded returning home. When I finally did so, Rosa was still at work. I gave her a call to see how she was doing, and she seemed stressed. It was a busy day, and she had been forced to take on a lot of extra paperwork, but she assured me that she would be done as soon as she could. The moment I walked through the front door, it felt like someone was watching me. I also noticed that it was absolutely freezing inside, even though it had been nice outside that day. I checked the windows to see if they were inexplicably open again, but they were closed. Then, I walked down the hall towards the porch and found the source of the cold. The door connecting our apartment to the facility was wide open, and a draft was coming in from the dark hallway. I closed the door, concerned with how it had gotten open, because we always kept it locked tight. After Rosa got in from the office, things began to get weirder. She was just as shocked as I was to learn the door in the porch area was open when I came home, but she had some news for me too. While I was at work, apparently the power had been going off and on all day, despite near-perfect weather. We had ended up purchasing one of those home CCTV systems you link up to your tablet device. Rosa had been watching the feed of the security cameras and said that she had seen someone walking around the facility, and whoever came through the front gate is who opened the door. As she was telling me all these strange things that happened that day, the door to the facility hallway slammed open by itself. We slowly approached the door to see who had opened it, but no one was there. We locked the door to the hallway again. The house was eerily quiet as we did so. It was then we began to hear a faint sound coming from the storage facility. It sounded like a dozen voices, all talking or singing in unison. Whoever it was, it had to be the same group of people that had been basically terrorizing us for weeks at this point. For whatever reason, we decided to confront them, and this may have been the biggest mistake we ever made. We headed over to the storage area the noises seemed to be coming from, banging on the metal door as loud as I could to gain their attention. Slowly, the door was opened before us. There, standing on the table, were 3 short figures with masks on their faces. We could not tell if they were kids or grown-ups with dwarfism, but surrounding them were taller, more interesting-looking figures, who also wore masks to conceal their faces. The 3 smaller people on the table were the ones doing the singing, only it sounded a lot more like chanting in some old language. Now that we were so close, as soon as they realized we were not invited, that we were not who they were expecting, the chanting stopped and all the masks turned to face us. It was only then that we saw a mass of blood and gore on the table in the center of the smaller figures. I only saw it for a moment before the door slammed shut again, but to this day, I have not been able to get it out of my mind. I still remember the smell that came from that room, the raw meat smell. It makes me sick to this day. We ran back into our apartment, locking the door behind us and immediately calling the cops. We struggled to relay just what we had seen, insisting that they just had to hurry, as we suspected that there were children at risk. But when they arrived, we could no longer hear the chanting sound coming from the storage facility. I was hardly surprised when the cops forced their way inside and found no one present. But what really confused me is that there was not a single trace of blood that we had seen. The cops told us that the forensic teams combed the facility and could not find a single fiber or a fingerprint to corroborate our story. Not long after we moved. It was awfully disappointing. We were practically living rent-free in that apartment, but when it came down to the horror we had experienced that night, money was no issue. I would have paid double what we are paying now just for peace of mind, because I never, ever want to run into those people again, because of another encounter, and I do not think things will go away so safely. I did not know much about St. Patrick's Day when I first moved to America. I was familiar with American culture, sure, and growing up in Hokkaido in Japan, I was vaguely aware that St. Patrick's Day existed, but I had no idea that it was taken so seriously by Irish Americans. So my first March 17th as a student at Boston University was certainly an eye-opener. I remember waking up that morning like it was any other. I threw on some clothes, ate some small breakfast, then headed out to Boston Common to catch the T to the university library. Almost everyone I saw had some sort of item of green clothing. Even smartly dressed businessmen had a little green pocket square or wore 4-leaf clover pins. I saw big groups of kilted men with those noisy bag things and even people dressed as small, red-haired creatures, though I cannot remember the word of them. Yet, I could barely believe my eyes when I saw the Charles River, somehow, some way, The city managed to dye the entire thing a bright green. Everything seemed to be bigger and louder in America, unlike Japan, where we almost pride ourselves on not showing too much emotion. I was reflecting on this for a moment as the T stopped and took on some more passengers. But as one man embarked on the train, he immediately looked and locked eyes with me. I said a silent prayer that he would leave me alone, but it was wishful thinking. He had already given me the kind of look that many girls dread. That kind of look that a cat might give a wounded mouse. Then, to my ultimate disappointment, he sat down next to me. He reeked of alcohol, so much that I had to subtly cover my nose to keep from feeling nauseous. I did not drink alcohol back then, and I still rarely do. The smell still makes me feel sickly, even to this day. So I simply put my earphones in and tried to keep to myself as the tea started moving again. A few minutes would go by, and I would feel the man turning toward me before the muffled sound of him saying something to me could be heard through my earbuds. I tried to ignore him as best as I could, but the man began to poke me in the arm to get my attention. I could not ignore him anymore, so I took out my earphones and asked him if I could help him in any way. "Why aren't you wearing green?" he asked me, slurring his words as he did so. At first, I had no idea what he was talking about, but I quickly remembered that wearing green clothing seemed to be a sort of tradition among locals on this date. Yet still, I did not wish to engage with the man, so I might have lied just a little to get him off my back. I don't speak English," I said, pretending to be ignorant. I thought this might deter the man. It was not the first time I had to pretend to not speak English to avoid a man's attention, and usually it worked. Not this time. He said, "Why aren't you wearing green?" He spoke much louder now, punctuating his final word by grabbing the sleeve of his own green pullover and waving it in my face. As he leaned in, another wave of his alcohol-soaked breath wafted into my nostrils. I could not bring myself to answer him. I thought if I tried to speak, I might just vomit up my breakfast, so I simply shrugged at him, as if I did not understand, then tried to go back to my phone. That is when I felt an intense pain on my left arm. I cried out, shifting in my seat and turning to see that the drunk man had pinched me. He was laughing as he did it too, with a little drool catching on his bottom lip before running down his chin. "You don't wear green, you get pinched," he said, still giggling to himself. Other people on the T noticed, and some were looking outraged that this drunk man was treating me this way. "Please don't," I managed to say, holding the part of my arm where the man had pinched me, but this only seemed to make him angry. By the time I had jumped up from the seat to move away from him, other passengers on the train were angrily shouting at the man to leave me alone. People in Boston are very friendly, especially the foreigners like me, and as I got off the train a few stops early, I decided not to let this experience tarnish the city's image in my eyes. After a long day of studying, I was headed back to my apartment in an Uber taxi when I got a text from a few friends. They told me they were having a few drinks in the big Irish bar near the government center. I forgot the name of it, but they asked if I would like to join them for some green beer. I'd never heard of green beer before, but they insisted that this was a big tradition in America. I was not entirely in the mood for drinking, but I did like the idea of seeing some of the parties, especially since it had only happened once a year. If the beer in the river were green, what else had Boston changed the color of? I had to find out. So I arrived back at my apartment, rushing upstairs to take a shower and changing my clothes. This time I tried to find something green to wear, only to find that I actually did not own anything distinctly green. I had a turquoise t-shirt, but that was about as green as it got. I texted my friend again, but she reassured me I could borrow the green scrunchie she had on her wrist. That way, I could be safe from more pinching men, hopefully. But as I began to walk around to the Irish bar, which was no more than 5 or 10 minutes from my apartment, I happened to walk by a tea station. Standing outside it was the last person I ever wanted to see. It was that same drunk man from the morning, with a brown paper bag in his hand. He had obviously been drinking since the exceedingly early morning hours, and he looked even worse than he did on the train. I hoped that he would be too drunk to see me or even recognize me. But to my complete and utter horror, I saw a flash of recognition in his eyes. He shouted after me, and I tried to walk faster to avoid him. But it was almost impossible. His rude, racist shouts became even louder, He started to run after me. I had tears in my eyes as I ran down the sidewalk trying to get away from him. I ran to the first police officer I saw, bursting into tears as I fell into his arms. I tried to explain what was going on, but I was panicking so much, and when I turned to point, the man who was following me was no longer there. Only happy, friendly partygoers, no sign of the drunk. Awful man. The police walked me back to my apartment. He was very, very friendly and understanding, especially since I was so upset that my English had failed me. Most people in Boston are genuinely nice and friendly, as I said, but some not so much, especially when alcohol is involved. I sometimes think the world would be quite a different place if people did not drink. Anyways, stay safe on St. Paddy's Day. This event happened when I was maybe 6 or 7 years old. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. I shared a room with my older brother, and my dad slept in the other room directly across the hall from ours. We had a bunk bed futon that sat in front of the door. I had the top bunk and my brother slept on the futon part. I remember I had this irrational fear that if I slept with my head facing the door and my feet towards the closet in our room, that monsters would eat my head and feet respectively. So, I always slept with my head facing the closet. This is only important because my brother slept in the opposite position as me. It was early in the morning on Easter. I would say sometime between 3 and 4 a.m. Something woke me up. I do not know quite what it was, but out of dead sleep, I just sat up and investigated the hallway towards my dad's room, where his door was only open ajar. The darkness was fuzzy, but I remember distinctly seeing bunny ears start poking from the corner. The hallways were like an upside-down L shape. Where the corner turned, it was met by the kitchen and adjoining living room. I was honestly excited because Easter Bunny. The ears became longer, and then a bunny face popped up, and then the bunny became larger. What stood about 4 feet began to stand as tall as the ceiling. Within just a few moments, it was a full-fledged bunny figure. I remember it was wearing plaid and had bright red eyes. I was not scared until it smiled. It had tons of large, razor-sharp teeth. I did not know until this point my brother saw it too, because as my young brain was processing this, I heard him whisper from below, "You see that too?" And then we both screamed. A moment later, my dad comes bursting out of his bedroom right through this demented bunny. Think Frank from Donnie Darko. And it just suddenly was gone and disappeared into thin air. My dad claims he never saw a thing and scoffed at us for making up such a dumb story to be awake early for Easter. My brother and I still talk about this event, and it has been well over 20 years. We just cannot explain it, and neither of us has had really any spooky events after that. This event took place quite a few years ago, so unfortunately, I do not remember everything that happened, but I do remember nearly all of it. Anyways, this happened when I was around 4 or 5 years old on Easter Sunday. My family always gathers at my grandmother's house to celebrate holidays, birthdays, etc. So, as we do every holiday, my mother and I started our hour-long trip to her house. My mother prefers to live away from all the city commotion, which explains the long drive. We were probably around 20 minutes away from our destination when my mom noticed that we were a little low on gas. So we pulled into this old, almost rustic-looking gas station with just a handful of customers inside. It was red and white with a few festive decorations outside, and lots of Easter stickers on the 2 large glass windows that were on either side of the door. My mom has taught me not to talk to strangers nor open the car doors for anyone, but she trusted me enough to leave me a car alone as she went inside briefly to pay for gas. She told me that she would be right back before going into the gas station. It felt nice that day, so the windows in the car were down so we could feel the breeze while driving instead of using the AC. While I was waiting for my mom, I remember adjusting the colored paper clippings in the Easter basket next to me. Then, I look out of the backseat window. When I looked over, I saw a tall, older man, maybe around 30 or 40 years old, approaching my window. He crouched down slightly and looked at me. "Hi there, what's your name?" I remember him saying. At this point, I remembered that I was not supposed to talk to strangers. So I told the man that I'm not supposed to talk to strangers, according to my mother. He then replied with, "Well, we can be friends then. My name's Charlie. And now that you know, I guess I'm not a stranger, huh?" At the time, I thought he was right. In my mind, I thought since a stranger is someone you do not know, this man was no longer a stranger because I knew his name. The man and I had a short conversation that I don't quite remember. All I remember is him telling me that I had a nice Easter basket. At this point, I started to get a sick feeling in my stomach. But being a child, of course, I didn't really know why. My mom then walked out of the gas station and noticed the man immediately, and began approaching the car quickly, asking the man what he thinks he is doing. The man seems to panic, and pulls my door handle violently. He quickly realized that it was locked, thankfully, and proceeded to reach in the window and grab me by one of my wrists, and attempted to pull me out. This obviously scared me a lot, causing me to panic, and pull against him. This caused him to let go and take off running. My mom quickly ran to the car and I unlocked the doors. She grabbed me and pulled me in an honest, painful bear hug. Then inspected me closely, repeatedly asking if I was okay. I ended up with slight bruises and redness on my arm where he grabbed me, but other than that, I was just shaken up. The reality of what had just happened set in at this moment, and I remember just crying and holding on to my mom right after I said I was okay. I do not remember anything after this point, but I recently asked my mom about it, and she said that she called the police immediately after. To this day, my mom still says that this was the most frightening moment of her life, and claims that if she had gotten there any later and came back to an empty car, she would not have been able to live with herself. This past Easter, my dad, a pilot for a cargo shipping company, was in town and offered to take me across the inlet for a nice dinner. As his co-pilots were away with their families, they were also invited to join, and gladly did. While I waited for them to validate their tickets in the ferry terminal, I spotted an unlikely duo standing by the door. Two guys, late 20s at most, one large and oafish, and the other shorter and movie star gorgeous. I looked just in time to see Oaf nod in my direction, and MS makes a face that can only be described as, meh, I'd mess with her after a few beers. They stood close to us in the terminal. Keep in mind, this ferry carries hundreds of people at a time, and I told my dad about the nod. He laughed and continued talking to his co-pilots next to us. Every time I looked over, MS was already looking at me. I shook my head. We sat on opposite ends of the ferry, Oaf and MS debarking before us. I was glad they were gone. We walked up the street from the terminal to the restaurant, and when I turned back to take in the view of the city across the water, I was surprised to find the duo had somehow ended up behind us and were slowly walking up the street. I tried not to think too much about it. It was a busy area and a lot of pubs were around. I did think about it a little bit more when they walked by the restaurant, peering intently into the front window, where we were standing waiting for a table. They smiled, exchanged words with each other, and kept moving. I let out a sigh of relief until they walked back from the opposite direction. They stopped. They leaned on a bike rack in front of the restaurant for a few minutes and then left. MS stared at us the entire time. Over dinner, I informed my dad and his co-pilots of the events that transpired without them even realizing it. They laughed about it and eventually had me laughing about it too. We would never see the pair of guys again. 3 hours later, as we waited for the return ferry, I was talking to our company, recounting a story from earlier at dinner, when I spotted Oaf and MS over my dad's shoulder. MS was looking my way. Scratch that, staring at me. I quickly informed the guys. They were shocked and kept looking back at the pair. There was a miniature showdown in the ferry terminal as each party stared at each other from opposite ends. I ended up getting a 3-man escort home that night. I'm not saying this is the scariest story ever, but damn, that sure ruined my Easter. So this story goes back to when I was probably 5 or 7 years old. at my old family house. We later moved out at around age 13, and I'm 24 years old now. The house was quite large, 3 levels, 3 bathrooms, a living room, a big man cave basement, kitchen, dining room, etc. Not that this is important, but it was a large space with lots of action always going on with my siblings and friends coming and going. Super good vibes, never anything paranormal. Just a fun, chill house. But yeah, 3 of the bedrooms, mine upstairs at one end of the hallway with my sister's, plus a bathroom and my parents at the other end. One night, on Easter, I saw something. I always slept with my door open. At this time, my bed faced directly into the hallway/staircase. Directly outside my room to the right was the bathroom, and to the left was my sister's room. And touching the staircase and railing to the exterior bathroom wall was a small coffee table sort of thing. It had a game built inside under the glass. We still have it at my mom's house. Also, it had just a few random decorations on it, nothing strange. So when I woke up, it was sometime in the middle of the night, and moonlight was shining in through the hallway window as usual. A decent amount, enough to somewhat light up the hall and staircase railings so it was not pitch black. Immediately as I woke up, I saw what looked like a super dark black figure. There were no details, just the shape. It was facing away from me on its knees, praying on the coffee table. You know, like the classic prayer stance, on the knees, head bowed down slightly, and hands pressed together. It looked just like a human figure, nothing demonic or anything, but the only thing that was different is that it looked like it was wearing a cloak or a hood instead of just a flat-out human shape, if that makes any sense. I was stunned, frozen. I hid under my blanket and went back to sleep eventually. And well, I guess that's it. A couple of other paranormal experiences apparently happened to my mom and some other kid's brother that she used to babysit, but nothing creepy really ever happened to the rest of my siblings. They said they never saw anything in that house or ever felt strange in their 15+ years there. And to mention, we are not religious at all, no church, no prayers, nothing. I don't really know what happened that night. It's one of the most unexplainable things that have ever happened to me. Maybe it was just because it was Easter that the ghost and spirit was there. I have no idea, but I will never forget it. I hope you guys enjoyed this story, as it was definitely a weird and creepy thing to experience in the moment. Hey Swamp Folk, sorry to interrupt these stories. I just wanted to say before we continue that I really appreciate all of your support that you give this channel and show. If you haven't yet, please hit that like button, give this podcast a 5-star rating, and perhaps share it with your friends. It helps the swamp expand its ever-growing waters. Thanks guys. Now let's get back into these stories. Around Easter of 2008, my 2 best friends and I went to a brocation. John's family had a cabin at Big Bear Lake that we were welcome to stay at for the weekend. It was a beautiful cabin-style home with views of the lake and the forested area behind the house. We did not spend much time in the cabin due to being young and adventurous. Our days were spent driving to Main Street to eat and walk around. On one of the days around lunchtime, we parked a block or so from Main Street. Anthony had to use the restroom and decided to make use of the forested area we parked next to. John and I continued to walk toward Main Street. What happened next is by far the most frightening thing I have ever witnessed, and I'm a veteran. I will never forget what occurred. The Main Street was not crowded but obviously busy with people going about their day. Both of us catch a glimpse of a little girl holding her nondescript mother's hand. But this was no child. This girl was wearing a puffy pink coat and her black hair was so long and straight. Her face was pale and skeletal. What caught our attention was her eyes, or lack thereof. Where her eyes should have been were empty black pits. We stood frozen for a moment, trying to grasp and rationalize what we are seeing. That instant, the girl turns her head and looks directly at us. As this happens, John and I grab each other and turn our heads as if we were blinded by a light. The feeling when she looked at us, as if she were truly looking through us, and burned as she did. When we looked back, she was gone. On cue, Anthony returns and is uncharacteristically unsettled by our expression. We explain to him what happened and simply continue with our day, walking up and down the main street with no further signs of the girl. John and I have talked about this story many times to people. Both of us are skeptics. I still have trouble saying it's a ghost because I simply do not know what it was. But having the same paranormal experience at the same time has been really hard to rationalize. Has anyone ever had a similar experience, or does anybody have any knowledge on what it could have been? This is definitely an Easter trip that I'll never forget, that's for sure. At the time of this event, I was 18, living in a large house in a wealthy area of England. It was the Easter holidays and my parents were away in France, leaving me at home to study for my upcoming exams. I had always enjoyed having the house to myself and was looking forward to being able to cook whatever, watch movies, and study in peace. I had little reason to be fearful as her house was big, modern, and separated from the local village by a very long driveway. I really enjoyed the week. I would eat instant noodles and revise during the day. I would go out with my friends and then watch Netflix till late into the night. We'd had lots of thunderstorms around this time, and the heavy rain and wind would set off the burglary alarms, much to my annoyance. I never thought anything of it and would dismiss any alarm going off as wind, so I'd sleepily turn it off. On Saturday afternoon, a sound startled me from my revision. It sounded like something had hit one of the stair windows. I turned off my music and listened, thinking I must have imagined it, so I turned my music back on. 5 minutes later, there was another noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like something had been knocked over. This time I jumped up, heart thumping, and racking my head for a plausible explanation, but this time one wouldn't come. I sat frozen for a few minutes before remembering that I could access the home CCTV imaging from my family computer. I checked the last hour, and there was nothing, so I instantly relaxed and laughed at myself for being so scared. Little did I know my jumpy instincts were about to save me. I started cooking dinner. The kitchen faces a set of glass doors on the far side of the room. It was now nighttime, so the glass reflects the light of the room and attached hallway. I'm in the middle of serving up the food when I glance up to see not only my reflection, but of a man standing in the hallway. He was short and scruffy, and had something I could not make out in his hand. He was staring at me through the reflection, motionless. My body went into flight mode. I ran across the kitchen to the back door and flung myself through it, running terrified down my road. Fortunately, I had my cell phone on me and called the police. I didn't see the man emerge from the house as I hid behind a bush in the driveway. Everything felt like a blur as the cops checked the house. They found nothing, and I started to wonder whether I just imagined it. It wasn't until an hour later that I found out the information that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The police checked the CCTV and found the footage of the man entering the house. He entered on Thursday night, 2 days before this incident happened. The unwanted housemate was found soon after and identified as a local homeless person. The incident was expected to be a burglary gone wrong. He was sentenced and is no longer a threat. However, I will never be comfortable being home alone again. A few times throughout my life, I've had things mysteriously vanish, only to turn up days or even months later with no explanation as to where they have been or how they've reappeared. It's been a few years since anything like this has happened to me, until recently. For context, I'm a backpacker in Australia, and in March this year I headed to Kangaroo Island to volunteer in bushfire-affected areas with an organization called Blaze Aid. While there, I lived in a tent in their makeshift campsite, which was actually the local cricket club grounds. My tent was a last-minute purchase, as I had originally been told that they would have a spare tent I could use, and then the day before arriving at camp I was told I would need to buy one, which resulted in me having to buy the only affordable tent left in stock in Adelaide's Target, a $39 teepee tent that sleeps 4 people. This tent, although pretty crappy, was spacious and allowed me to spread all of my belongings out. Bear in mind, I live out of a couple of backpacks, so it was nice to have a wardrobe for once. As coronavirus became an issue in the rest of the world, we were isolated from it all on that small island. But we were told as interstate borders were shutting off and the future of the camp was uncertain, if we have somewhere safe to go, we should leave ASAP. I had met a fellow volunteer who had offered me his spare room in his house in the city, and I agreed to take him up on that offer to have somewhere safe and warm to wait out the pandemic until I can get home. 2 days before leaving, it was a sunny, warm day, so the camp coordinators organized a barbecue for everyone, and we set up one long table outside in the sun. My friend and I got there a little later than everyone else, and the only seats that were left were the side facing the sun. So we both agreed to go and grab our sunglasses so we could actually enjoy the meal and talk to those who sat opposite to us. We run to our tents, hers is next to mine, and look for our sunnies. I put everything out of my backpack, searched through the wardrobe, even lifted up. I can't find it anywhere. I have no idea where they went. I was kind of pissed off as they were new after losing my last pair in Perth. But I went and had dinner, making a mental note to make sure I put my sunglasses somewhere specific in my bag when I find them. The next day, I take everything out of my tent to get ready to pack up. I empty my bags out completely, do all of my washing, remove the mattress and bedding, everything. No sunglasses. I repack my bags several times before leaving and conclude I must have lost them somewhere along the way, and I just have bad luck with sunglasses. Fast forward to a week later, and I've moved into this guy's spare room. My room is in a separate little building at the end of his garden, and I've half unpacked all of my clothes as and when I've needed them, but I decided that since coronavirus is probably going to be around for a little while longer, I might as well get comfortable and unpack fully. My backpack is on the floor in the middle of the room. I opened it, and there, on top of all my stuff, are my sunglasses. As if someone had just placed them there and zipped my bag back up. I was a little freaked out, and messaged my friend who started freaking out too. I was glad to have found them, and eventually I just chalked it up to a weird experience. Then, things got even weirder. Not long after it was Easter. The guy I'm staying with has a kid who he shares custody with his ex. He's a really great kid, 7 years old, very well behaved, and a lot of fun to be around. Easter morning comes around and his dad has gone a little overboard with the Easter eggs and his kid has a whole bucket load of them, all different sizes. Now, this kid is great and all, but he's a little strange in the fact that he isn't really interested in chocolate. He likes it, but he doesn't turn into a little sugar demon like most kids do when they have a bucket full of Easter eggs in their hands. He's more happy to share them with us and isn't really focused or fussed about eating them. He puts the bucket on his bed, and we play games in the living room, and we have a good day together. Then, after dinner, his dad tells him he can have an Easter egg for dinner if he wants. He goes into his room, then comes back to the living room looking confused, saying that all the small Easter eggs have disappeared. We laugh it off, saying he must have misplaced them or they've fallen into the bottom of the bucket. So we tip it out, and sure enough, there are only medium and larger size ones in there. We search his room, under his bed, even in between the bed sheets, and there's nothing. We asked if he's just tricking us, and he starts to get upset, insisting he has no idea where they've gone. Our next thought was maybe the dogs ate them. He does have 2 chocolate labs, ironically enough. But there is no way the dogs could have managed to eat them without us noticing, without tipping the bucket over or something. And why would they have specifically chosen to eat the small eggs when there were much bigger eggs on top? Even still, we kept an eye on the dogs and an eye out for any foil in their poop. But there was absolutely nothing. When this kid was at his mom's house, we did a full-on search of the house thinking maybe he was just having a laugh or had forgotten where he had put them. Nothing. 20 or so small Easter eggs had just vanished. We still don't know what happened to them. I never told this guy about my missing sunglasses, because I thought it would just freak him and his kid out. But I get the feeling these eggs will reappear soon, and questions will be raised once more. This story isn't necessarily a horror story, more of a strange occurrence. But I think it fits your show. This story stretches over a few days, so bear with me, my friends. I work at a barbecue restaurant that is considered convenience food. Everything is homemade, and we get fresh ingredients every day, but we work on the same timetable as a fast food place. So you walk up, place your order at one of our registers, pay, and then wait for about 5 minutes and your food should be ready. Given this, your face-to-face interaction with customers doesn't need to be super long. Keep this in mind whilst reading. I'm a female in my early 20s and pretty decent looking, so I'm accustomed to customers making weird comments or old pervy men trying their occasional attempts at flirting. But only one customer has ever raised multiple red flags and set off all the alarms in my body, telling me to run. The first time Jared came in, it was a few days before July 4th. One of my coworkers happened to be with me at the register. After placing and paying for his order, Jared talked to us about the holiday and how he's super excited. Just a rather normal conversation. Then he turns his attention only to me and tells me that I look like a Barbie. Not an uncommon comparison, as I have blue eyes and at the time long blonde hair. But his compliments didn't stop there. He continuously repeated my likeness to the doll, adding in beautiful and stunning, among other choice descriptors. His name was called for his food, so I thought the conversation had ended there. But was I wrong? Oh, dreadfully wrong. I was running around doing my side work when Jared came up to me at the counter and said he had something to show me. I looked around to my coworkers for help. They had taken note of how strange his comments were towards me, but none of them had noticed he had come back up. I put on my best customer service smile and followed him to his table. As mentioned, I work at a barbecue restaurant, so there's barbecue sauce on all the tables. When I got to Jared's table, he was pointing at a spot on his plate where a fly was squirming in the sauce. My first thought was the fly must have landed in the sauce he was using. I was about to apologize and get him a new plate when he said, he landed there a few times before I finally got him. As he said this, he poured more sauce on the fly, laughing and smiling as he did so. Absolutely mortified, but also trying not to show how freaked out I was, I said, "Oh, that sucks. You're just torturing him now. Why don't you let him go?" Jared says something along the lines of, "No, he's having a great time. Can't you tell? Look at him swimming around," while still pouring sauce on the poor fly. I know it was only a fly, but I couldn't look at it struggle anymore, and to be frank, he made me extremely uncomfortable. Trying to be as polite as possible, I told him I had to get back to work. I told my manager Dana and a few other coworkers what he had done, and we all agreed it was fairly disturbing and definitely weird. He didn't come up to the counter again until he was about to leave. He stared at me as he walked up, waved, and said, "Goodbye, Barbie. I'll see you soon." I hoped he wouldn't. A day or so goes by and Jared came in again. I was at the same register talking with one of my coworkers. He comes up to order and starts discussing the 4th of July again, as it was the next day. We told him the restaurant is actually going to close on July 4th, so we were happy to have the day off. Again, normal conversation until he reaches over the register, grabs both of our hands while speaking to us, saying it was amazing and we deserved a day off. At this point, he still hadn't even ordered his food, but was still holding our hands. So I changed the subject by asking what he would like to order. He started ordering and had let go of my coworker's hand, but still held on to mine. I gently tugged my hand away, saying something like, "Oh, kinda need that to type in your order." He looked incredibly mad when I did this, but quickly covered it with a short laugh. Thankfully, he got his food to go, so there wouldn't be another fly drowning scenario I'd have to witness. After he paid, he left my register to go wait for his food, ending our interaction. A few minutes later, he comes back up to me, cutting off customers in line, and says, "Hey, did I ever show you a picture of my girlfriend?" I know my mind thought the worst case scenario, but as he pulled out his phone, I was convinced he was going to pull up a picture of me. He didn't, thank God. It was just a Facebook picture of a very busty woman in a very tiny American flag bikini. The entire time, he was just staring at me, smiling, almost gauging my reaction. I just kind of laughed it off and responded, "Oh, that's cool." He puts his phone away, never breaking eye contact with me, and says, "Yeah, she's hot, but nowhere near as hot and as beautiful as you are." I gave him a very quiet, thanks, and a nod. Fortunately, he left the restaurant a couple of minutes later, but only after he stared at me while walking away. Yes, the picture you have in your head is correct. This man walked sideways and backwards as he walked to the doors and never took his eyes off me. Once he got to the doors, he made it a point to stand and wave until I looked at him and waved back. Dana came up to me after he left, saying if he comes in again, she and I will have a code word, and I'll go hide in the back until he leaves. She did not like the way he talked to or about me. I was thankful she shared the same feelings as I felt. I couldn't help but feel that maybe I was being dramatic or my uneasiness wasn't warranted. The third and last time Jared came in, I was on my phone with a customer who was placing a large to-go order. The phones were directly behind the registers, so there was no avoiding him. I was grateful I wouldn't have to take his order this time, but I also couldn't run and hide. It was bittersweet. It was the day after 4th of July. I avoided eye contact with him as best as I could because I didn't want to talk with him when the phone call ended. It was working until he reached over the register he was at. My coworker Sarah was highly confused, waving his hand around trying to grab my attention. I reluctantly waved back and continued to take the phone order. I could hear Sarah asking him questions to get his order correct, but he was completely ignoring her. He was apparently trying to talk to her about me. "Isn't she a perfect Barbie? What a beautiful Barbie. A busy Barbie girl, isn't she? She's a beautiful girl." This continued, even after the phone call ended. But instead of talking to Sarah about me, he thought it was best to talk to me about my appearance. At this point, customers are starting to take notice at what was going on, and poor Sarah was stuck in the middle of not knowing what to do. I did my best to ignore his words and just nod in hopes he would get the message that I didn't care, as I was still just trying to do some paperwork for my to-go order. He was incessant and still had not placed his order yet, so he had no reason to walk away from the register. To my relief, I heard my name being called from the office. I looked at him and said, "The boss is calling me." And Jared says, "Wow, you really are a busy, hard-working girl. Don't worry, Barbie, go do your job." I left, feeling his eyes on me as I walked until I disappeared into the office. My general manager, Ron, told me Dana said to call me in because I needed rescuing. I was and still am very grateful for Dana. I briefly explained what was going on and who the guy was, and Ron looks at me and asks if I wanted Jared kicked out. I told him no, but I wanted to hide until he was gone. Ron told me that was fine and to stay in the office until he came to get me. He came back a few minutes later and said Jared was staring at the wall where the office was when he came out to see what Jared looked like. Ron packed up Jared's food and said he barely made eye contact. He continuously glanced in the direction of the office and was visibly angry the entire time. Ron said if he ever came in again, to just abandon ship, go to the back, and stay there until someone told me the coast was clear. I never saw Jared again. This was almost a year ago, and my stomach still drops whenever I see a customer that slightly resembles him. On July 4th, 2018, my house was broken into. My birth month turned out to be the worst of 2018. July is, for many reasons, unforgettable. This story is from the point of view of my 19-year-old sister. This was pretty early in the morning. My sister woke up to our German Shepherd, who had jumped into her room. Due to a baby gate being in the way, he made enough noise to wake her up. She then told him and shouted at him to leave. He wasn't allowed in her room. After a few moments, a tall, blonde man peeked his head in. Our home is a 3-bedroom trailer, her room being at the front, closer to the driveway, and 2 on the other side of the house. Her room is an absolute mess, and there is a bookshelf blocking part of the doorway. Let's call this man B. The man started talking to her, saying something along the lines of, "Oh hey, I was just looking for a random person's name here. I thought they were here." My sister, being as she just woke up, wasn't on edge. "There is no one by that name here," she said in a calm tone. B then started making small talk, asking her age, if she had a boyfriend, etc. After answering a few questions, she saw B light a cigarette. "Hey, you can't smoke in here," my sister said, still calm but kind of alert now. "Oh, sorry, I didn't know," B replied. He then put it out in the wall. After some time, he pulled his phone out and acted like he had someone picking him up. He then tried to talk my sister into waiting outside with him. She told him that she would and she just had to change. B nodded, then went and unlocked the front door. My sister got up and locked the front door. She then called my dad, an ex-cop that works just up the road. After he got home, she went to look around and see how he got in. In her oldest sister's room, on the complete opposite side of the house, she saw he had pushed a window air conditioner out and onto the bed, which was level with the window. My sister has her cats in that room, which the man didn't seem to care about, and just walked out of that room and closed the door. He then walked down the hall with 2 small dogs and a big German Shepherd barking at him. He had no fear and kept walking. In the living room, he then bent down and started pulling at our Xbox. That's when the German Shepherd jumped into my sister's room. My dad found the guy walking around the block and stopped him. He warned the guy not to come back, and so far he hasn't. The worst part for me is I love sleeping on our couch in the living room. What if I had been asleep on that couch when he came in? What if our dog didn't get between B and my sister? I don't know what happened that day, honestly. Even though I have the details, it still doesn't make sense. This is true, and I'll share more stories in the future. This happened during the summer of 2008. For context, I am a gay male, and at the time I was in a relationship. We'll call my then boyfriend Mark for privacy reasons. Mark was 35 and I was 30. It was July 4th weekend, and my boyfriend wanted to go camping, as he always has every 4th of July. Usually going with his ex-wife and son who is 7 years old. However, since he is now out of the closet, he wants to take me with him. A little bit about me. I'm definitely not an outdoorsy kind of person. I don't like dirt, I don't like bugs or wild animals, and the thought of not having running water or a roof over my head absolutely terrifies me. Yes, I know, I'm spoiled rotten. As reluctant as I was, Mark persuaded me to go and reassured me that this would be a weekend to remember. Well, he didn't know how right he was. He told me we would be leaving Friday morning, which was the 4th, and would come back Monday morning. As we both lived in San Jose, California, the nearest place to camp would be the Santa Cruz Mountains near Felton and Big Basin Boulder Creek vicinity. We were going off the map in a more secluded area to experience nature and less people. We headed out Friday morning around 7 a.m. if I remember. It was about a 45-minute to an hour drive. On the car ride there, Mark told me about these people that supposedly live in the mountains. At first I thought he was just trying to scare me. I was thinking about Wrong Turn and The Hills Have Eyes in my head. I told him that, and he chuckled and said no, but there are some similarities. He explained in great detail that these people were uncivilized, not socialized, and unlike the rest of us in society, could possibly be extremely dangerous if we encountered one of them. They basically live like cavemen. He told me, even though he has never came across any of them, he knows they exist and have even been told by his brother that they do indeed exist. Having just heard this, I flipped and told him it's a good thing you just sprung this on me now, because you and I both know I would not have come along with you knowing this information. He explained that he was just letting me know to try and not frighten me, but to inform me if anything should happen, we basically know why. He said he can pretty much guarantee nothing will happen though. Oh really? I said. How can you possibly guarantee me that? I always come prepared, he said. If you don't believe me, then open my glove compartment, he said, pointing to the glove box. I did as he asked, and opened the glove compartment inside. I noticed a leather case. I pulled it out. What's this? Fearing what I already suspected it was. I opened it, and right before my eyes was a revolver. A gun. Basically, I don't know anything at all about guns. I really don't want to mess with it. All I know is that it was black in color. This is your guarantee, I suppose. Yes, you must have known on some sort of level that I wouldn't take us out into the middle of nowhere and not have us protected, he said. I guess maybe in the back of my mind, I thought, yeah, but seeing it now makes me very uncomfortable, I said. Then, also knowing that there is a slight chance of something happening for you to bring that gun out makes me a bit more scared than anything else, I said. He looked over at me and said I would not let anything ever happen to you. This weekend is for us to enjoy each other's company, and that's what it will be. You'll see, he said. He did a good job of reassuring me because I didn't think much about the gun again. We reached our destination not too long after that. All around me was just nature. Trees and trees, branches, rocks, and boulders everywhere you could barely see the sky from all the trees blocking out the sunlight. We'd begun to unload everything from his Toyota Sequoia. I was impressed by what he had brought. A 2-bedroom tent, a king-size airbed, and a portable generator with 3 outlets to run power out of. Wow, I said, maybe this won't be so bad. He smirked that smirk I loved. Now that I think about it, I think it was more of an arrogant smirk. Well, my cell phone didn't really get any service out there, and basically, it was useless. But I did use it as my MP3 player. Smartphones were just starting to make their way to availability, so I just had my Motorola Razr. I was already ready for an upgrade back then. Mark said, well, I need the power because I have to get some work done this weekend, as he pulled out his laptop from the back seat. What am I supposed to do while you're working? I said. Don't be like that. I saw the books and magazines you brought, and you have your Nintendo DS, so you obviously had ways to occupy your time as well, he said. He was right. I did bring things to entertain myself and was absolutely delighted that I could enjoy them longer with the help of portable electricity. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday were all uneventful. We took hikes, made campfires, took naps, relaxed, and barbecued. I did actually enjoy myself. That was until Saturday night. We were in bed, Mark was asleep, and I was reading R.L. Stine, Fear Street. Yes, I know, cliché, but I love those books. I thought I heard something in the distance. Now, I was kind of used to the little noises of animals like chipmunks and squirrels running around through the leaves, but this sounded more distinct. Footsteps, not that of a 4-legged animal. It sounded more human, like someone was trying to walk as quietly as possible without being detected. No, I thought this was just my imagination from reading this book and I was freaking myself out. I set the book down and started to strain to hear more. Closer. Whatever it is, it's getting closer. A bear, maybe. I looked over to Mark, who was sound asleep, contemplating what to do. The footsteps eventually reached the tent. Right above our heads was a zippered screen window that we had zipped closed at night because we didn't know if it would rain or not. Whatever was there was just outside, and it had stopped. I held my breath. All I could hear was my rapidly beating heartbeat. I heard someone else breathing. Not Mark. Whoever it was outside. I wanted to wake Mark up, but I knew if I did, he would wake up and make some kind of noise that would alert whoever was out there. That was when I heard a click. I know the sound. It's the same click when you open up a pocket knife. Oh my God. I thought, this is it. This is where I'm going to perish. Damn you, Mark, I thought. I knew this was a bad idea. That's when I heard scraping, running across the tent. I knew what they were doing. They were running that knife all around the tent, taunting us. I knew this person had to know one of us were awake. Why else would they be doing that? The sound of the blade went all along the side of the tent and came back around to where we were, then started again. It was then I nudged Mark to wake up. Mark, I whispered. He started to groan, and then I said, shh. I whispered, there's someone outside. I couldn't see his face or anything for that matter, because I had turned off the reading light. There is someone outside, I whispered. Look. I then saw a flashlight shining on the tent. Mark reached over the side of the bed, grabbed his case and pulled out the revolver. He yelled, stop. Whoever the hell is out there.
I have a gun, and I will not hesitate to shoot you in the face. Leave now, or regret it." The flashlight switched off, and whoever it was started to walk away. Not even a speed walk, just casually walking away without any light. It was pitch black out there. Mark held onto the gun as I lay there in horror. Silence. Nothing, no sound at all. We didn't say a word. We were just listening for any kind of sound. Somehow, in all of that chaos, I must have fell asleep because I woke up to Mark shouting my name to come outside. I rubbed my eyes and looked at my watch. It was 6:15 a.m., and it was already light outside. I darted up and ran outside to see what he was yelling about. I ran to see him kneeling down by his tires. Slashed. I looked at the other ones, and they were too slashed. The driver's side and passenger side window had been broken and shattered. "What the hell?" I shouted. "What are we going to do now?" Mark grabbed my hand and said we're going to walk back to the main highway as fast as we can before whoever did this comes back. "My wallet!" I cried. "I need my wallet, my keys, and my phone." My phone was still in the tent, inside my bag. I rushed over to the tent and grabbed my messenger bag, realizing, oh wait, my wallet and keys are in the glove box. "Oh, crap," I said. I ran over to the glove box in the Toyota, swung open the door to notice the glove box was torn open and everything was gone. I started to cry. Realizing that this situation is too much for me to deal with, my heart sank into my stomach and my knees got weak. I felt like I was going to faint. "Mark, they have my driver's license, my house key, my money, my bank cards," I cried. Mark yelled so loud I heard his echo in the distance. "Let's go now," he said. "It's about 1.5 miles to the highway. We're going to have to flag somebody down or find a call box since my phone is dead," he said. "Don't say that word, please," I told him. Weak and scared, I started walking with him down the dirt road. Weak and scared, we started walking down the dirt road we drove just a couple of days prior. As we walked, I could sense that there was someone or something else near us. I had that feeling of being watched. "Oh no," I thought. "Please let us get out of here in one piece." Mark stopped. He put his finger to his lips and said, "I know I don't think we're alone. I can hear leaves crunching. I think we're being followed. Just keep moving and know what I told you on the way here. I mean it. I'll do whatever I have to protect us. I will not let anything happen to you." Thank goodness for that gun, I thought, but I wish we weren't in this predicament to begin with. Speed walking got me tired and thirsty. Then I could hear cars in the distance. "We are almost there," I said. "Yes, just a little bit more." Finally reaching the highway, I pulled out my phone and I had a signal. Not much battery, but just enough for us to call the police, and Mark called them. They were there in about 5 minutes. 2 patrol cars arrived. Mark explained everything while I sat on the curb. I was questioned about the events and said all my identification cards were stolen, my house keys and car keys. The officer told me to cancel all those cards immediately and have my house locks changed ASAP. He also suggested to have my vehicle's locks changed as well. I didn't even know you could do that. 2 more officers arrived, talking to Mark and helping us go back to the camp to get our stuff. I didn't really want to go back, but having the police with us felt somewhat safer. Mark had called his insurance and was expecting a tow truck there soon. When we arrived, 3 of the officers looked around, took pictures, and questioned us some more, and sealed off the area with yellow tape. It made it look like a crime scene, which I guess it was because a crime did take place there. The officers asked Mark and I if we had any idea who or why someone would do this. I said no, and furthermore, I didn't tell anyone besides my mother and best friend that I would be coming out here. Mark said he only told his ex-wife where he would be at the time, who was home with their son. The officer explained to us that it was likely an isolated incident and it could have been someone who most likely didn't agree with our alternative lifestyle. Big surprise, I thought. But even this was extreme, and I wasn't really buying that load of crap the officer was telling us. It seemed like he knew more than what he was telling us. "So, what's going to happen now?" I said. The officer told me, "Well, we have your information and report. We will investigate and we will search for fingerprints and other evidence. If and when we come up with any leads, we will let you know. You might have to testify against any culprits we apprehend. Until then," he said, "get all your locks changed, cancel your credit cards, and let us know if you came up with any new information. Great, I thought. So I guess that's it. About 10 minutes later, the tow truck arrived, we gathered all of our belongings, and we got out of there. I was confused that nothing in the tent was stolen, not even Mark's laptop. Now, if I let my imagination run wild, I could think of other things that didn't make sense, but I didn't want to go down that path. On the way back to the city, I was in so much disbelief, I wanted to say to Mark, "I told you so," but he looked so hurt and confused, I couldn't do it. Plus, it sucked to be right. I mean, I really did want to enjoy myself this weekend, and it started out pretty good. I got home, canceled everything, and had my mom call the locksmith and change all the house locks. I made an appointment for my car to get the locks changed as well, and left it in the garage. I was still tense, just knowing someone had my address and keys. Even though they couldn't unlock my house door, that wouldn't stop them from breaking in. I don't think anything ever came of the situation, or if it did, Mark never informed me of it. We spoke about it and he was constantly checking in with the police department. He bought a new SUV, he didn't want any kind of reminder of that weekend, and I agree on that. We broke up a few months later for other reasons. I always wondered if he ever went camping again after that, or if he regretted that weekend. As for me, it's been about 12 years since that horrible weekend. I now live in a different state where people do camp a lot. Good for them. I haven't camped since then, and I don't think I ever will again. I used to fear the dark. There was always something menacing about the unknown, and for that reason, I used to be a skeptic. Yes, I used to be, as after the story I'm about to tell you, I had a change of heart. It all began junior year in English class. My teacher, who had always had a way of making her class unique, decided that given the time of year, October, we should have an assignment relating to the eerie feeling Halloween cast. The assignment was to visit a haunted house or write a summary of your visit. My group of friends and I had just had the debate whether or not ghosts are real, and I had strongly opposed their existence. I'll spare you the details, but we soon embarked on a 2-hour drive to visit a popular haunted mansion that we had recommended to us. My friend, let's call him Wayne, would tell me on the way there about his grandfather who had killed himself. He said, "Bro, I swear to God, if my freaking grandpa reaches out to me tonight, I'm going home with or without you." Clearly, I was missing pieces of the story. Anyways, we got there, and things went pretty normal. All the hosts would try to creep us out. Groups of girls would constantly be whispering and giggling, and the supposed medium told us the history of the mansion and its past owners. You know, the usual things. Things took a different direction after the lights went out, though. No one spoke a word. We all just sat there waiting for something to happen. Soon, my friends and I began seeing colors. Purple, green, red, smudges, as I would describe them, scattered the room. It almost reminded me of the eye blurriness, except when I turned my head, they did not move along with me. Instead, they would remain in the same place I left them. Being the rational one out of the group, I yelled out, "Yeah, alright, this is cool, but I'm not convinced." Keep in mind, the medium and I had previously talked about my skepticism, and she had mentioned to let her know what I think. She responded with, "Well, spirits, would you like to show him he's wrong?" Not going to lie, I about peed my pants after that comment. A moment later, I heard a whistle. Granted, it was very faint, but it was unmistakable. Following this, I saw something I will never forget. Keep in mind, we are in a pitch-black room with no windows, but what I saw was a man kneeling in front of me who was darker than the darkness that surrounded me. I thought to myself, "Oh God, you're going crazy." But something in me said that this was not my imagination. I stuck my hand out to find that the area in front of me was ice cold. Not only that, but my friend even made a comment saying, "Oh crap, we got a ghost over here, guys." There were a few other things that happened in that room, but nothing so concrete as that. However, I am not done. It was 9 p.m., and everyone was getting ready to go home, but something told me to stay. You see, my uncle passed away unexpectedly 5 years ago, and it was incredibly hard on my family. I felt guilty because I'd never really gotten as close to him as I wish I had. and always, in a way, hated myself for not crying after hearing about his death. I wanted closure. Another thing to note, I am not one to walk up to strangers and begin a conversation with them. But like I mentioned before, something compelled me to do it this time. I introduced myself formally to the medium, this time, and asked her if she had the time to talk about my uncle. The very warm lady said she was definitely okay with that. She smiled and told me, of course, tell me what his name was. I told her his name and answered a few questions like when he passed and so on. She quickly replied, he is here. As I am standing in 30-degree weather, I feel the warmest I had ever felt. She started listing characteristics that were very specific to my uncle. I knew she couldn't be making it up. All my guilt had vanished, and to this day, I still get teary-eyed thinking about the sheer amount of love I felt. After my uncle, she asked my friend group if there was anyone else who wanted to speak. None of them spoke up, but she wasn't finished. She said, I see someone who carries a tremendous amount of guilt. Would that be anyone you guys know? No one said a word. His name is Al. My friend Wayne choked. He said Al was his grandpa's nickname. He killed himself. For the next 10 minutes, she told Wayne about Al's guilt and shame. I noticed Wayne's fists were clenched. Wayne was angry and didn't talk much the rest of the night. I know this wasn't anything compared to a Wendigo story or something like that, but for me, it was enough to completely change my perspective on life. I am no longer afraid of the dark, as I know my uncle is watching over me. Ironically, I ended up never writing that essay for English and ended up with a 0 on it. But I figured this was my perfect opportunity to share my story. Thank you, and I hope you can all find closure in my story. Hey Swamp, this happened to me at a Halloween party several years ago. To start off, I'll have to explain the geography a bit. My grandparents live in a small community at the peak of a mountain. I don't think it's considered a small town, simply a community. I won't say the name because a lot of people up here are kind of off the grid, and it's about a 45-minute drive from my city, which is about halfway between San Jose and San Francisco. The only things in this community besides houses are a restaurant and a fire department. The annual Halloween party takes place at the fire department, and every year my cousin, who we'll call Ruby, and I would go there after we trick-or-treated with my dad, her mom, or both. My grandparents helped run the party, and at the time were involved with emergency services of the community. The year this happened, I was about 10 years old, which would make Ruby 7. This year, her best friend at the time came with us. I cannot remember her name, but we'll call her Kira, because her most distinguishing feature was her bright yellow hair. I remember her being taller than both of us, with eagle eyes, and generally gave off an HBIC aura. Basically, ideal for a shy girl to stand behind in a crowd. I sort of assumed she was the same age as Ruby, but I don't really know. So this year, the party started the same way as it would do any other year, with us doing various games, activities, and winning, you guessed it, candy. At some point, we went on the deck. The fire department, like most houses on the mountain, began on the second floor and had a wooden deck surrounding it. There were about 10 other kids hanging out on the deck, so we decided to play tag. Being not physically inclined, I found myself as it for most of the time. Now is when things got scary. At some point, I felt hands under my underarms. I didn't think anything of it at first. Ruby was and still is deceptively strong for her size. Whenever one of us had a birthday, we usually rented a bounce house and she sometimes picked me up and threw me. Before I even had time to process this, I was in the air and upside down. I don't specifically remember the certain points of air, impact, and on the ground crying. They sort of all kind of blurred together when I tried to remember. I have a moment of clarity when I was laying on the ground in shock, with nothing happening, but the next thing I remember I was crying with Ruby next to me. Kira had run inside and got my dad and auntie, and at a certain point, they were next to me too. During the game of tag, there were a couple of teenagers watching us. Don't get the wrong idea. These were responsible kids. We knew 2 of them. They and several other kids had seen the attacker. They described him as a middle-aged man with glasses and jeans, and that's all they can remember. No one recognized him or knew who he was. Keep in mind, this is the kind of area where everyone knows everyone. There was this one person up there, though. that was kind of known for being a creeper, always having weird behavior. Mentioning his name had the same effect on locals as dropping the name Voldemort or something like that. That was what several people were guessing, but people who saw it said it was not him. This community does not have a police department, but there's a small force of rangers. Several were there with their kids, so they sent a group out, but they never found him. A firefighter came over to make sure I didn't have any brain damage, a broken neck, or anything like that, and someone got me an ice pack. To my knowledge, they never found the attacker. I didn't go up the next year. In fact, I don't think we went until I was a teenager. We haven't talked about that night since then. Except when I do, something perceived as quirky or airheaded, someone will comment that time I was dropped on my head as a child. I am 23 years old now, but I still remember this experience. I am a male, and when I was in around first grade, about 6 or 7 years old on Halloween night, my parents took my sister and I trick-or-treating, and I remember feeling super excited. Halloween was always one of my favorite holidays. I remember we went to the rich people's neighborhood because they always gave out the most candy. I remember I got a bit too excited and went on ahead on my own, and as a kid, I was so amazed at everyone's costume. I would often go up to random people, look them up and down, and compliment them on their costume. I know, it was not a good idea, and probably wasn't incredibly safe to do this, especially being on my own. But I was a kid, so I didn't really know any better. One of the people had a scary mask on, and I was blown away on how cool and detailed it looked. I had to tell them. I just had to. So I did. I went up to him and told him how much I liked his mask, and he just stared at me for a few seconds. He pulls at his arm and grabs onto my hand with a tight grip. I tried to pull away, but he was not letting go. Instead, he continued to keep walking while holding on to me. I was so terrified that this stranger wasn't letting go and was taking me somewhere with him. I started screaming, but with crowds and crowds of people, nobody really realized what was going on. I was looking all over the place trying to find my parents, and I managed to spot my mom in the crowd not too far behind me. She also saw me calling and was calling out to me while trying to reach me through the crowd. The stranger must have noticed because he immediately let go and took off very quickly into the sea of people. I caught up to my mom, and for a second, I decided not to tell her. I don't know why, I didn't. It was only until a few years ago that I actually brought it up, and she said that I never told her about it, and was so surprised that I had gone through this. It is scary though, knowing that some people out here kidnap children so easily, and do God knows what to them. I was lucky enough to have been found by my mom when I did, but who knows what happens on Halloween every year. Be safe, swamp folk. This happened on Halloween of 2019. My friends and I were feeling the spooky vibes of the month and wanted to do something fun and exciting to satisfy our thirst. Being the dumb college students that we were, we decided on exploring somewhere allegedly haunted in the hopes of seeing some genuine paranormal activity. Since we're from Illinois, the popular destination of Bachelor's Grove Cemetery immediately came to mind, and it was settled upon. Once the sun had set and night had fallen, we made our first move, sneaking into the cemetery after it had closed to get the full experience without having to worry about any other visitors. I must admit, I always wanted to do something like this before, but it was genuinely terrifying. I was kind of afraid of what might be waiting for us in that cemetery so late at night. Stories always circulated around from the various apparitions people had encountered here, the different sounds that chilled them to the bone, and so on. Anyway, all of this was festering inside of me well before we started driving over to the cemetery sometime in the evening. It was a pleasantly long drive, but I wasn't really in the mood to think about anything else except for the potential horrors that roam the cemetery for all of eternity, or so they say. Coupled with the fact that we are going to be trespassing this entire time to get through in the first place, I was pretty nervous. My friends were apparently doing a much better job at keeping their fears in check though. For the sake of the story, I'll call them Logan, Paul, and Eddie. The entire car ride there, they were laughing and joking around. seemingly not worried about what we would be getting into or what we might see. Looking back at the entire situation, I should have known that their optimism was a bad sign. No way we would have been able to explore this place without being the slightest bit nervous, but what's done is done. A little past 7, once night had finally fallen for real, and darkness went on in every direction for as far as the eye could see, we arrived. Parking in the main parking lot was out of the question, because we did some looking into it and found that in previous years, local law enforcement liked to wait there and catch any would-be explorers before they could even get inside. So we had a backup plan. Since the actual cemetery was in the corner of a dense forest on all sides, essentially forming a square where all the roads would go around it, we were to park at some restaurant that was open super late and had a huge parking lot, all the way in the back, furthest away from the restaurant itself and closest to the road. This was the exact opposite direction from the front entrance of the cemetery, so we figured this was our best chance of getting in while avoiding cops. From there, we'd cross the street on foot and have a bit of a walk before arriving at a somewhat hidden path leading into the forest. Taking this back path would take a bit more time to get to the actual cemetery itself, since these trees were particularly thick and dense, but it was well worth it when considering the alternative. After everything was said and done, we found ourselves beginning our trek into the path, unsure of how far we'd have to go before we find what we were looking for. It was a windy night, and even though it wasn't especially cold or anything, I remember my teeth chattering and my skin going cold. Aside from the occasional sound of leaves being crunched under our shoes as we walked, there was absolute silence. My once cheerful and energetic friends were now suddenly quiet and subdued. Logan had this odd expression on his face, it being illuminated by my phone's flashlight as we walked. It was some sort of cross between fear and pain, like every step he took was causing him physical harm. Before I could question him about it, we found ourselves at our destination. Here we were, in the heart of Bachelor's Grove, with graves all around us and a certain chill in the air. It was decided that we would all split up to cover more ground, promising to call each other if we found anything or encountered anything. I didn't want us going too far away from one another, but I also didn't want to seem like a pussy, so I kept my mouth shut and began exploring. Most of the graves I looked at had either withered away from time and the elements, so I could hardly make out anything that was on the tombstones. The few dates that I could read went back all the way to the 1800s, and a sinking feeling in my stomach started once I realized these people had been dead and decaying in the ground for well over 100 years now. Feeling extremely uncomfortable with this realization, I began to back away from the graves and started to look for my friends to see if they had found anything supernatural yet, when suddenly, I heard it. Not just me either. All of us did. It was low, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention, but with the way our senses were heightened, there was no way we would miss it. It appeared to be some sort of chanting, and it sounded like it was coming a little bit north from our direction, further into a clearing. I couldn't make any of the words out being spoken, or if it was even in English, but there was something creepy about the tone. Like it was religious, and the chanting was some sort of prayer. The voice that was doing the chanting was deep and gravelly, belonging to some sort of man that we could not see. The four of us shined our lights on each other to see our expressions at that very moment. We knew what we were going to do. Despite every fiber in my being telling me not to go any further and see what the source of this chanting was, my curiosity got the better of me, and I just could not resist. Eddie whispered to us to turn our lights off completely, while he dimmed his just enough to where it wouldn't attract too much attention, but we could still be able to see with it. The next few moments we spent creeping towards the noise. The more and more I started to lose it. My breathing was uncontrollable, and it felt like my heart was beating 1,000,000 miles an hour. I was so afraid of what we would find, and yet I still had to know. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we had entered the clearing, and were a mere few steps away from the chanting. Eddie shone his light in the direction ahead of us just for a moment. We saw a cloaked figure bent over something in the grass, still chanting in that unrecognizable language. The thing in the grass looked like some sort of circle with a mark in the center. And I swear to God, I wish I could tell you that I'm lying about this, but when I realized what the symbol was, I felt like I was going to throw up. There was no mistaking it. It was a pentagram, made of some sort of strange material. For the brief moment that Eddie had illuminated the sight in front of us, I had been able to get a glimpse of the pentagram's material being bright red, and I shouldn't have to say any more than that. Once the light from Eddie's phone hit the back of the man's head, he immediately stopped chanting and stood up, still facing the direction of the pentagram. I can only describe the next few minutes as truly unadulterated terror, because before we knew it, he screamed a blood-curdling scream that rattled us to the core and turned around, beginning to sprint towards us. Everything happened so fast, I couldn't even make out the man's facial features except for deep, sunken eyes and an expression that radiated pure hatred. He really did want to bring us harm. Not wasting any time, we all fled in the direction we had came from, running faster than I think any of us had ever ran in our entire lives. I couldn't even muster up a single scream while running away. I was so petrified, I could not make any noise. Maybe it was a miracle, but we somehow, some way, managed to retrace our steps all the way through the path we took to enter the cemetery and forest, and eventually came out to the main road, which was devoid of any traffic for the time being. Afraid of what I would see if I looked back, I made a beeline to the car along with the others and hopped into the back seat. Not wasting any time to lock the door and roll up the window, we peeled out of there in no time flat and didn't stop driving until well over 20 minutes later. I honestly have no idea how far or how long that man chased us for, but I do know this for sure. We weren't supposed to be there that night, and we must have interrupted something important. I'll never know what it was, and honestly, I hope I never find out. We don't really talk about this, and I can't even remember the last time any of us even got together to hang out. But I don't think we ever will do anything like that again. I think that fright we felt is enough to satisfy us for the rest of our lives, and I'm thankful beyond words that we all managed to get away, alive. The scariest thing that ever happened to me on Halloween was back when I was living in Liverpool for university. Halloween is always a big night for students, as is pretty much anywhere else. It's a yearly event that involves dressing up and getting pissed. But since Halloween is a really good excuse to wear considerably less clothes than usual, party-oriented students tend to get particularly excited about it. So I'm in my second year at this point, living with a bunch of my student mates just off Smithdown Road, which is where loads of students can get shared houses for really cheap rent. We heard that this big house party was happening just down the road from us. One of those that had its own little Facebook event page set up to keep track of invites and give people directions to the house. I remember my mates sitting around the kitchen table, all staring at the screen as they went through all the profiles of girls that said they were attending. I mean, some of them were absolutely gorgeous, so we were all definitely hyped about it. Only just a few days before Halloween, I started to feel really grim. I had the shakes, I was running to and from the toilet every half an hour to erupt from both ends, and I could barely keep any food down. This persisted for about 48 hours straight, and thankfully it abated by Halloween itself. But I still felt way too rough to do any serious partying. The last thing I wanted to do was end up browning myself in front of like half the girls at our uni. I mean, every lad wants to be a legend, don't they? But for the right reasons. So anyway, on the day of the house party, despite my mates insisting I make an appearance and throw together a costume, I made the firm decision to stay home and chill for the evening. As much as I felt like I was missing out, I just didn't feel up to it. So about 7ish, my mates were pre-drinking in the kitchen, while I'm up in my room looking to order the spiciest curry I can get my hands on, in the hopes that it would purge the rest of the sickness out of me. So I could start the following week feeling fresh again. So about the time I'm burning my face off with a chicken vindaloo, my mates are just about to head down for the house party. They are about to go off for a night of debauchery, I guess. There are a few final pleas for me to join them, but these are violently rebuked. There might have been a chance of me joining them before the curry, but afterwards, no chance. I was in a full-on food coma. So a couple of hours later, I'm just chilling on the couch and wondering why British Netflix had such a dire collection of horror films, when there's a knock at our door. My first thought is that there's been some kind of puke-related disaster, and wanted the lad to come back to get a change of clothes before heading back to the house party. I mean, this wasn't entirely out of the question, since the house party was only around the corner. Safe staggering distance for anyone that had drank a little bit too much too quickly. But it then occurred to me that there was no chance it could have been trick-or-treaters. Smithtown has a big mix of residential and student housing, so there was also a decent chance it could have been kids looking for sweets, but also not too much. So to save the house getting egged, I leg it to the kitchen and grab a few bits of the cupboards to offer any potential trick-or-treaters. But when I answered the door, Mars bars in hand, there was no one there. Maybe I had just taken too long grabbing sweets, or maybe it was just me kind of imagining that I heard something, or simply some sort of knock and run type of deal. But either way, there was no one to be seen. So I head back inside, plonk myself on the couch, and get back to digesting the ton of curry I had just eaten. A short while later, I'm still watching Netflix and about ready to doze off, when something in the corner of the living room catches my eye. You know when you're so used to looking at a certain something that just the oddest little difference catches your eye? Well, I definitely happened to notice that there was a little less of an orange streetlight outside coming through the little crack between the curtains and the window. Like, this dark shape was outside, standing at the window. I sit up nervous, and it disappears from view, allowing me to see the orange light illuminating the street outside again. Someone had been watching me. I get up, rushed over to the cupboard under the stairs to grab my housemate's cricket bat, then edged towards the front door. I threw it open, ready to swing at whatever was out there, but again, there was nothing. I started to feel like I was going mental at that point, but maybe I was just exhausted from being sick for most of the week. I had not slept very well all during the few days prior to Halloween, and I tried to reassure myself that maybe I was just a wee bit jumpy from being overtired. I decided it was best that I just get an early night, telling myself I'd feel much better in the morning. I did a bit of washing up, got a shower, and put on some comfy clothes to get ready for bed. But just as I do, there's another knock on the door. Only this time, I can clearly hear some young-sounding voice go, "Trick or treat," from the other side of the door. I'd almost jumped out of my skin when I heard the door go, but the voice was weirdly reassuring. I mean, it was only trick-or-treaters, right? The worst that could happen was I got a few eggs thrown at me or some toilet paper lashed over my house. I walked downstairs, grabbed the handful of bars I'd fished out of the cupboard, and then opened the door. I was expecting to see a gaggle of kids, but I didn't see anybody. There was just one small-looking figure standing in the pathway a couple of feet away. They couldn't have been any older than a teenager, but they definitely looked a bit too old to be trick-or-treating. I do not imagine they had been particularly intimidating, otherwise the mask they were wearing seriously gave me the creeps. It looked old and it smelled like disgusting, unwashed latex on the inside. I'm not even sure it was meant to be a Halloween mask. It was like an old man's face with these tiny black eyes and a big white smile stretching from ear to ear. I made some derisive comment to him like, "Aren't you a bit too old to be trick-or-treating?" But held out the handful of Mars bars toward him anyway. I reckoned he'd just tell me to bugger off, snatch the sweets, and leg it down the path. But he didn't. The lad just stood there, looking at me from behind the mask, not even moving to take the chocolate bars from me. I asked him if he was alright, starting to actually get creeped out by this behavior on top of the weird old mask he was wearing. But still, they didn't say anything. There was something intensely creepy about not being able to see his actual eyes behind the mask, and the longer we stood there in silence, just staring at each other, I felt myself tense up. Then, right as I'm about to give him an awkward goodbye and shut the door, I hear a loud noise coming from behind me. I didn't really think the situation through. I just reacted, running into the kitchen at the back of the house where the noise was coming from just in time to see someone smash the back door open. About 3 or 4 people then pour into the kitchen, all wearing masks, some armed with baseball bats, others with big knives in their hands. I turned around and leg it back towards the front door, planning to run upstairs to my room where my phone was charging to ring the police. But to my absolute terror, blocking the way to the stairs was the little lad with the mask on. Only this time he had a knife in his hand too. He had been in on the whole thing the entire time, and as he pointed the knife in my direction, all I could do was raise my hands in this "please don't stab me" type of way. "Get on the floor now," he said. His voice, that seriously sounded like he was no older than about 14. Like he legit sounded like a child, and that scared me even more. A grown man might have the presence of mind to not hurt anyone and keep the severity of their crimes to a minimum. But a kid? Bloody hell, I thought he might just stab me for the fun of it. I'd heard stories about gangs all over the world making younger kids commit violence just to sort of prove themselves, and that's what had me shaking as I lay down on the carpeted floor in the hallway, face down with my hands on the back of my head. I listened as the gang just completely ransacked the house. I couldn't see exactly what they were taking, but I heard them mentioning laptops and phones and some stuff like that, laughing to themselves as they absolutely raided each and every room in the house. At some points, I heard them smashing and crashing things. They just took it upon themselves to commit as much wanton destruction as they liked, giggling maniacally to each other as they realized they had the time and freedom to do pretty much whatever they fancied. I thought if I just lay there, keeping still and quiet, that they'd leave me alone, but that was just wishful thinking on my part. Obviously, they had made their way through the hallway a fair few times, and whenever they did, they'd literally walk all over me, which was painful enough, or they'd get in a few kicks here and there, and then just listen to me grimace. I think the worst part of the physical abuse is when I heard them say, "Kick him in the balls," to one of their mates. I tried to shut my legs, but they still aimed a few kicks. Exposed, and in a lot of pain, I was lucky enough to be able to tuck up my boy parts, if you know what I mean. There wasn't anything too delicate exposed, but still, the idea of getting my bollocks crushed under the trainer of some disgusting little thug had my heart practically jumping out of my throat. It sort of reminded me of a scene from A Clockwork Orange. They were there to rob us. That was bloody obvious, but they clearly took a great deal of joy just being able to terrorize someone for a bit. And they seemed to get a real kick out of realizing that I wasn't from Liverpool. At one point I said something like, "Just take what you want. Please just don't hurt me." They just burst out laughing. I wouldn't say I'm posh by any stretch of the imagination, but I'd definitely say I'm more spoken than a lot of your average scousers out there. They started mimicking me with these piss-take voices, stamping on my head and kicking me. I just lay there wishing I'd never said anything. After what seemed like forever, listening to those kids ferrying about my belongings into the alley behind the house, they finally left. But not before one of the knives were put to my throat, and they told me they'd be coming back to cut my head off if I even as much said anything, or if they even saw a police car in the area. Then as quickly as they all appeared, they all ghosted. I waited for a long time before I found the courage to stand up, and as I tried, my knees were way shakier than I care to admit. I went from my room to another room, surveying the destruction. The place was a mess, but the thing that amazed me and gutted me more than anything was the sheer amount of stuff they had taken. God knows how they had gotten it all from the house. They had taken TVs, game consoles, audio equipment, pretty much anything electrical that wasn't nailed to the ground. It also looked like they had taken pretty much all of our trainers. They had also raided all of our closets for any clothes that they apparently liked. I wanted to call the police. I really did, but with what phone? I'm almost glad I got a few kicks to the head, otherwise the sense of shame and humiliation might have been too much to bear. I ended up knocking at my neighbors' houses, but unlike me, they were way too smart to answer their doors to strangers on Halloween. It was probably the single worst experience of my life up to that point. I had just to go sit back inside the house, and sit there on the living room couch with my head in my hands, just trying to hold back tears. It was hours before any of my drunken housemates arrived back. Before that, I think I just sort of sat there at the kitchen table, in the one room that hadn't been completely ransacked, just drinking a few tins of lager, feeling absolutely shell-shocked, until finally two of them who hadn't pooled returned home, and that's about the end of it. There's no real resolution to this story. The police couldn't do anything other than take down a list of things that had been stolen, and maybe look for any laptops that turned up in pawn shops.
Hey Swamp Dweller, I love your stories, and as promised, I have a few stories of my own from South Carolina. I want to start off by saying that I am a female in my 30s. This happened when I was 11 or 12 though. My brothers and I are adopted from the Cherokee bloodline, and are very sensitive to unnatural things. So our stories start at a young age, but it was something my adopted mom said at Thanksgiving that made me and my brothers look at each other with absolute fear that none of us had felt in many years. Mom told us that she had been having nightmares about a demonic-looking dog creature with glowing yellow eyes since Grandma had passed, and she was now living in her house. So, my brothers and I went outside to recant the issues we had at the time. As I said, I was 11 or 12, which means one brother was 10 and the other was 9. We had gone to Grandma's every summer, which was fine because Grandma had a massive plot of land smack dab in the middle of nowhere. Our great uncle lived across the wood line and had cattle and chickens, and we would usually enjoy our time at his farm. An hour and a half of being stuck in the car, and we got to the farm. We still have a bit of time before the sun goes down, so we slipped into our muck boots and started walking around the great big field in front of Grandma's house. Something had caught my attention on the other side of the area, though. My brother Jay then looked at me and asked, "Kay, what did you see?" I said nothing at first, and we continued to play for a bit, but I felt uneasy the entire time, as was my young brother. It just felt like something was watching us across that field. As it starts to get dark, my grandma lets the dogs out to come and try to retrieve us from playing, which was how we knew it was time to go home. No matter where we were in the woods, the swamp, or anywhere else on the property, the dogs would find us. So we get back to the house, and we get ready for bed like usual. Now, it's about 9 o'clock on Thanksgiving evening, and I hear one of the cows outside lowing very loudly, like she was being attacked or something. I look out my window and see some massive creature with yellow eyes attacking this poor cow, absolutely shredding it. The following day, my uncle came to the house and asked if we had seen anything in the pasture last night, as one of the beef cows had been mutilated. I stay quiet, as my adopted family doesn't believe in supernatural things anyway, and I didn't want to be ridiculed anymore. He explained that he did not want us going into the woods until they figured out what was killing the cows. But a few days later, a farmer down the road saw a pack of coyotes, and I guess they got the blame. So after that, my brothers and I went into the woods, and we explored the area where I had seen this thing watching us the first day. We go about 100 feet into the woods or so, and we came across a large bramble patch that looked like it had been molded into the shape of a cave. A thing about these brambles is that unless you have incredibly thick leather work gloves, you will bleed from the inch to inch-and-a-half long briars. Immediately, my brother G starts to cry. He just can't bring himself to talk, and he just stands there and starts to cry. Jay and I get to G, and we try to get him to tell us what is happening, but he cannot compose himself. As we began to walk away from this cave structure, my grandma sends the dogs out, signaling it was time for lunch. At this point, we had a black chow lab mix named Molly, and a smaller white and red mix named Sandy, neither of which would have harmed us. Now, I bring this up because Molly was tearing through the trees as if something had been ready to attack us. Molly was my dog and very protective of me. As soon as my lovable pooch gets to us, she starts growling, and she starts herding all three of us back toward the house. I stopped to see what my beloved dog was flipping out about, and she bit my pant leg and started dragging me right out of the woods. We get back to the yard, and G is finally calm enough to tell us that he swears he heard our grandmother calling us from the swamp, further in. Jay and I look at each other and scratch our heads. We hadn't heard Grandma at all. That night, my brothers and I were a bit restless, and as soon as it was summer and we had no actual bedtime, we decided to play ghost in the graveyard in front of the house. We get the torchlight, and I am it, of course. So we never really go too far from the house at night, especially after that. So we play at the front, knowing that it is safer, as there are wild animals in this part of the state as well. I call out. All are free to end the game after 10 minutes of not finding each other. The guys come back to the front of the house when we hear my voice from the woods call, "All free!" We stop, and I point the ample light toward where my voice came from. In the morning, we see a vast, looming figure, dark as sin with large, yellow eyes, call out again, "All's free!" We got our asses inside and stayed there for the rest of the night. Even to this day, sometimes when we go out there, we have seen the eyes and hear my 12-year-old voice call out, "All's free!" So, to the creature in the woods, I don't know what it is, but I don't ever want to meet it. I'm sending in this story in the hopes that I can find others who share similar experiences. This is the experience that actually got me into the paranormal. I was about 10. The year was 2000 if I have to guess correctly. It was Thanksgiving. My birthday is November 23rd, which is Thanksgiving like once every 4 years. I can't recall if the day in question was one of my birthdays or not, but it's not really essential. Okay,
So I live in South Mississippi, and for the holidays, sometimes we see our extended family one town over. They have a big house, a lot of land, and live out in the woods, and have smaller buildings around the main house used for storage. When we arrived, my parents introduced me to a cousin I had never met before. His name was Zach. He is about a year older than me, making him 11 at the time. We hit it off instantly, and we went upstairs to play Mario Kart on the Super Nintendo. After an hour of that, we ran outside for a little bit, which led us to exploring the smaller buildings on the property. We came across one that could have been an apartment for someone. It had a small kitchen, a refrigerator, a TV, and living area, and some workout machines on the first floor. It wasn't a big building at all. The upstairs consisted of 2 empty bedrooms and a tiny hallway dividing them. The upstairs rooms were to immigrate left and right on the top of the stairs. Me and Zach went up there and found a space to the right, but the door on the left was closed. So we went back to the first floor, fired up the TV so we could be away from all the adults for a while, and were just hanging out. One of my uncles even came in to grab some frozen food from the freezer at some point and told us to have fun and be safe. The usual adult platitudes. If I remember correctly, about half an hour goes by, when out of nowhere, we hear a loud crash. It sounded like a car crash or maybe something akin to sharp metal objects falling. However, it seemed to be coming from upstairs and not anywhere outside of the house. So naturally, we wondered what the heck was going on. So we, me going first, went to the staircase to see what was up. And there he was, a neon green figure, like how the Flying Dutchman from SpongeBob was depicted, transparent, bright green, was staring over the railing. It was hanging halfway out of the previously locked door staring at us. The door was now cracked open. His torso stopped at the door. Anyways, Zach and I both screamed bloody murder and ran back to the main house and told our parents, who laughed it off as us just being kids. I think someone even said it could be a deceased cousin of ours who stayed over there at some point or another. To this day, my mother brings it up because we both love the paranormal. But it being so long ago, I'm sure my memories have distorted it a little bit. However, the image of the green man sticking through the door and leering down at me on that Thanksgiving day will forever be in my memory. So if anybody has any similar stories, I'd love to hear them. I usually listen to the show and don't send anything in, but I've had a few stories in my time that kind of line up with some of the stories I've heard on the show, so maybe I'll send some more in. This experience happened at sometime around 1:20 a.m. Thanksgiving morning 2018. I lived in Southwest Washington State at the time and had rented a vacation home in Lincoln City, Oregon to accommodate me and my sister's family, who was flying in from Hawaii for the Thanksgiving holiday. We had all arrived at the rental around 3 p.m. About 7:30 p.m. my son started yelling for me. He said my 1-year-old grandson had gotten into my case with my blood pressure meds, and sure enough, one of my pills was missing. We panicked and called Poison Patrol, who told us to call 911 ASAP. They sent an ambulance and took my grandson to a small hospital in the area. The staff there did what they could but told us they were not equipped for the situation, and my grandson needed to be transferred to Randall's Children's Hospital of Portland, Oregon. So on Thanksgiving Eve, a pediatric ambulance was sent from Randall's to Lincoln City, about 2.5 hour to a 3-hour drive due to the holiday traffic. It arrived around midnight to pick up my grandson. My son's wife rode in the ambulance with my grandson back to Randall's. My son and I went back to the beach house to get diapers and clothes and all that. We started driving to Randall's at about 12:30 a.m. Okay, so here's where we encountered something that my son and I will never forget as we live. We had been on the road for about an hour at this point, and had just passed the Spirit Mountain Casino on Highway 18, where, in the area, that was all hay farmland in between Bellevue and McMinnville. The road has 2 lanes, only, and is a long deserted road, especially at that hour of night. The ride between was very emotional as I felt incredibly guilty for having packed my meds in a side pocket of a tote bag where my grandson could access it. I was terrified for him and crying. My son was also upset, and although he was trying to hide it, I knew he blamed me. Anyway, here is the crazy part. As we were driving, I noticed my son slightly drifting in the road because he was falling asleep. Twice I asked him if he was okay and if he needed me to drive, So, being that I was very concerned that he may fall asleep, I was very aware and watched the road in front of us, making sure we would not hit anything. We were going down the road at about 55 miles per hour. In the distance, we both saw what, at first, we thought was a deer running in our lane of the road, coming straight at us. But within a couple of seconds, we realized it was no deer at all, but a golden-colored horse. It must have been around 250 to 300 feet away at that point. It got closer fast, and as I said, we were traveling at about 55 miles per hour. As it got roughly 150 feet away, it leaped upwards and morphed into some giant owl right before our eyes. The wingspan stretched past our lane in the road. My son and I estimated it between 12 to 15 feet in wingspan. This thing was enormous. As soon as we saw that, my son yelled out, "What the f-?" And we swerved the car to the left to avoid it. And just as he did this, the owl immediately landed about 50 feet ahead of us to our right. In that little area outside the white line, like the bike path area, the owl tucked its head into its wings and into its chest, like it was scared and trying to hide. As we drove past it, I got a good look at it from my window, and its head and wings tucked in, it still came up to about the bottom of the window of the Subaru. It seemed like it was wider and bigger than that of a beach ball, so about 3.5 feet tall, 20 to 24 inches around the body. This thing was giant. Now, as soon as this happened, it was almost as if a trance came over us. It affected both of us in very much the same way. 1. We both did not speak a word the entire drive at all until we got to the hospital. 2. We both lost all feeling of being tired, and it felt like calm, alertness, and awareness took over. I've never even felt that fear, that he would fall asleep after the encounter anymore. And 3. The memory of the experience was crystal clear. Still, curiosity, wonder, or even awe did not hit us until I drove back through that same area the next afternoon after my grandson was discharged. Suddenly, I started letting everything I saw that night pour out in front of us. The same thing that we saw, my son's wife was asking us questions about it, and we were both yelling out the same answers. It was mind-blowing, and to this day we talk about it and wonder what we witnessed that night. We both agree that this seemed to be some sort of mythical creature or shapeshifter or something. We both agree that whatever it was good and meant no harm. Maybe it was a guardian of some sort. Hopefully, anyway. The fact that we both saw it is incredible, though. I don't know if animal spirits, shapeshifters, or magical creatures exist, but this definitely sealed it for me. Four years ago on Thanksgiving, I went to visit my mom and uncle for dinner. Later in the evening, I usually have more than one Thanksgiving to attend since my parents are separated. It was dark at this point, as I turned down the long winding country road that led to my mom's house. For context, my uncle's house is by the road, but my mom's house is down a gravel driveway on the same acre of land, separated by a gorge. As I got closer, I saw the bright flashing lights of ambulances, cop cars, and fire trucks. They were parked right in front of my uncle's place, so I immediately freaked out and was scared that something terrible happened to my family. However, since they were blocking the road, I couldn't get in. I turned around and sped off, opting to arrive at the top half instead, which worked, and I was there and parked within 5 minutes. I ran up to my uncle's porch where people I hadn't met before were standing, some crying with their arms covered in blood. I saw my uncle and asked if everything was okay and what had happened. One of our neighbors had ingested a cocktail of pills and alcohol, then crashed his pickup truck in the front of the house. There were 3 people in the truck, all of which were ejected. 2 of them were sitting on the porch covered in blood. The third, the driver, our neighbor, had died in the road about 30 minutes earlier. Even worse, one of the guys covered in blood was his son, but unfortunately, it was his own father's blood. I was told afterward that they cradled his head as he lay in the road bleeding from his ears, nose, and mouth. It was a downright tragic scene. Now, I'll get to what happened next. About a month goes by and nothing out of the ordinary has happened. Then, out of nowhere, my uncle hears a voice early one morning, sometime around 6 o'clock. "It hurts." He told me it sounded like someone was in pain. Long and drawn-out raspy calls. My uncle immediately thought that his son, my cousin, had probably gotten into a fight and had stumbled home or something. He jumped out of bed and went to the porch to check. It hurts, it bellowed out again, but this time from behind the house. My uncle said it kept calling and moving around, but eventually trailing off near the wood line. He followed the noise but never found whatever or whoever was making it. I found out about this a few weeks later when he told me, and he was dumbfounded, and so was I. It's honestly something straight out of a cheap B-grade horror movie. I couldn't believe it, but I know how haunted the land is because I grew up there. I made no connection to what happened at Thanksgiving. His wife didn't believe him either, saying she was next to him and didn't hear a dang thing. She's the deepest sleeper in the world, though. That was the last I heard about it, until about 2 months later. My uncle's wife was in the bathroom and heard it for herself. It hurts. This time from within the house. She said she froze, as it called out 3 more times. The voice had moved from inside the house to the front yard before stopping. She was now a believer. It happened twice, but never again after that. My uncle has a theory, though. The guys on the porch, covered in blood, asked if they could wash their hands in the house. Of course, my uncle allowed them to, but he now thinks that it invited something into the home. It was the literal washing of the neighbor's blood down the drain that allowed it to manifest. My uncle also told me later that when the man died, he could smell death. He said it smelled awful and rotten, but lasted only a few seconds at a time. I wasn't there to witness the voice, but my uncle and his wife, who is a skeptic, have 0 reasons to make up a story about their dead friend. A year ago, I was at their house and saw the shadow of a man in the road move behind my car before disappearing. I believe it was the man from Thanksgiving night. My story took place in November 2004. I remember that precisely because George W. Bush had just won his 2nd term as the United States President. I was around 9 years old at the time. I am 25 years old now. Yet, this memory has always stayed vividly at the forefront of my mind. I can remember it like it was just yesterday, and it still makes me so uneasy to think about. I've never spoken about it to anyone until now. It was a regular day for me. It was the Friday before Thanksgiving, and our school gave us a whole week off for it. I was particularly excited about the weekend because my parents allowed my best friend to stay over for the weekend. It's all I could think about that day. I was at the pickup student line, which meant that a relative or a guardian had to be on their records with a signature to pick me up from school. I was too anxious to ride the bus, and I was much too nervous to walk home alone, despite living in a friendly, small town. That day, my grandma was supposed to pick me up from school, but unfortunately, both my parents were working late. So, I was going to go to her house, and my mom would pick me up there after work. Well, you might be able to tell where this is going. By the time my school was out, my grandma was nowhere to be seen. So I waited in the lobby for about 30 minutes. By this point, it was about empty, aside from the janitor mopping the lobby floor. I was getting nervous. My grandma forgot to pick me up, so I went to tell the office lady that my ride never showed up. I was a pretty anxious kid, like I mentioned, and I didn't know what was happening. The lady was lovely. She sat me down in her office and tried calling my grandma. No luck. She tried calling my parents, who said my grandma should have been there already. My mom said she reminded her this morning and would try calling her. Unfortunately, she was at work for a few more hours and couldn't get home yet. It was probably 4 p.m. at this point, and I had been at school an extra hour, and I was petrified. I was all alone with this office lady, and I could tell she was frustrated. Everyone had already gone home, and she couldn't get on with her week because of me. At one point, the janitor walked into the office. It instantly smelled like cigarettes when he walked in. He stared right at me. He was a tall, husky man with long, greasy brown hair, with a bit of a screwed-up face and crooked nose. That was the first time I had ever seen this man. I had never seen him around the school before. Considering the small town I was from, it was weird that I didn't recognize him, but I guess it wasn't out of the realm of possibility. His presence instantly made me nervous. I'll never forget the way he looked. He struck up a conversation with the office lady. I remember this part clearly for some reason. He asked her what she was still doing there. She told him, and then nodded in my direction. He looked at me intently and sat down next to me. I can still smell the cigarettes to this day.
Hey kid, I bet you're excited about Thanksgiving break. Bet you're excited about your family time. Me too. Listen, Your grandma's place is on the way to my house. I know her and your grandpa too. I'd love to give you a ride over there. I know right where it is.
He said to me. He continued.
I know it's scary to feel lost, but I'd love to help you out.
He smiled at me. I looked over at the office lady. She looked gleeful that she wouldn't have to wait another hour with me for my mom to get here. She said, "Why, that would be great. My husband is waiting for me to get home now." He stood up and said,
Great.
Then, without my permission, he grabbed my hand, pulled me out of the seat and said,
Let's get going then. Grandma must be worried about you.
I shivered. I thought about what he said. He said he knew my grandpa too. Unfortunately, I didn't have a grandpa. He had passed long before I was born and divorced my grandma many years before that. I sat back down and shook my head without saying anything. He looked at me blankly, and the office lady looked disappointed. Then he walked out without saying anything. 5 p.m. rolled around and my mom finally showed up to get me. It turns out my grandma had forgotten to set the alarm and was sleeping the entire time. When I went to my mom's car, I saw him again in the lonely staff parking lot smoking a cigarette. Finally, he looked in our direction, got in his truck and drove off pretty sporadically. The thing that gives me shivers is that he didn't drive towards my grandma's house. Instead, he took a left from the school which would have taken you out of town to the city, the opposite of where he said he was going. I never saw him at school again. I had never seen him before that, and I have cried thinking over this so many times. I remembered I had so many nightmares for years and years where the office lady made him take me with him so she could go home sooner. I attribute this to my development of anxiety and paranoia later in life, but this was one of the scariest things that ever happened to me.
I've always liked to just go hunting. Rather it was deer, hog, or turkey hunting. Last Christmas, I got a brand new camouflage silver-barreled 30-06. After that Christmas, I was super excited to take it to the deer stand the next week. Finally, that day came, and we were going to spend the night, Friday to Saturday. My dad and I brought our RV with 2 beds just for us. His bed was on one side, and mine was on the opposite side, beside the door into the camper. When we arrived, we got everything ready, unloaded our 4-wheeler from the trailer attached to the back of our RV. We jumped onto the 4-wheeler. My dad would take me to the patch I hunt in. It is beside a swamp on a hill. My dad hunts in a patch beside a creek. My dad dropped me off at my patch about 1/8 of a mile away. I got my 30-06 loaded, and my dad gave me my bag, and he left to go to his patch. I started walking toward my stand. It is an enclosed tree stand. I tied my gun to the string and climbed up the ladder. I pulled up my gun and opened the stand door. I put my bag down, put my gun up on the rest of my stand, and started to look around the patch. Nothing. I lay back to wait for a while. Eventually, a doe walked by. I looked, and I did not see a buck behind her. I kept looking at her to see a buck walk out, but this was no ordinary buck. It was very skinny, and its eyes were green, but it had a huge 11-point rack. But it had something dangled up in the rack. It looked like a spider web or something. Maybe there were some bones stuck in it, I don't know. At the end of its antlers, it looked like something was spiraling off. They were very skinny antlers, and stuck straight out of the front of the face. The mouth looked like it had red liquid on it. I thought nothing of it at first. I never thought it could be blood or what it was. The fur was all wet, and parts of the deer had no fur at all. It seemed to be cut up as if it were severely sick or something. I clicked the safety of my gun off. The deer looked straight at me. Its feet faced toward me. It started walking toward the stand. I was in a confused state. It started to jog toward me, still looking directly at me. Then I shot. It stopped, kept looking at me, then suddenly jumped on its hind legs and screeched a furious screech. It hurt my ears, even under my earplugs. Louder than a gunshot, the doe ran off. Then it jumped right back down on all 4 legs and ran in the opposite direction away from me. But not in an ordinary way. It was almost like it would skip steps or levitate every few steps. Its head was throbbing back and forth. I have never seen such a horror in my life. It went out of sight into the woods, down the hill, and I looked out the window in a terrifying shock. It screamed again, shorter and quieter this time. Then, the woods fell silent. About 5 to 10 minutes later, my dad came in on his four-wheeler. I got my bag and gun. Usually I unload my gun before I get out of the stand. This time I kept it loaded, with my gun on the safety the entire time. I got to where my dad was. He said, "I heard you shot." I ran up to the four-wheeler and said, "Did you hear that scream that deer made?" He said I didn't hear a scream, only a gunshot. I told him everything. He then said it was probably my imagination. This is what a typical parent would say to a 16-year-old with such a story. I kept telling him I was not exaggerating. The deer was on 2 legs and screamed. But he kept saying the same thing. We finally made it to the RV. It had already gotten dark at this time. We got inside, changed, and we laid in our beds. I never could go to sleep that night. I kept thinking about what happened that evening. It was not really about missing the deer that was the problem, because I know for a fact that I hit the deer in the lungs, but rather the fact that this deer got on 2 legs and screamed at me. I was finally dozing off at around 11 that night when I heard something scratching at the door. I heard grunting of a deer, then antlers hitting against the front of the RV. I was scared out of my mind. I reached under my bed and grabbed a box of rounds and then my .30-06. I took out a bullet and was going to load it into the gun. Then I heard banging on the door again. I quickly loaded the bullet, and without thinking I turned the safety off. The screaming and banging stopped all of a sudden, and then I heard one last scream. It was something like bloody murder. A deep scream, about the same rhythm as I'd been hearing all before, but it wasn't like a screech this time. There was something so guttural and demonic about it. I got up and got close to the door. The screaming stopped and I heard the leaves crunching of it rolling back on all fours. I put my hand in the lock of the door and slowly unlocked it quietly. I put both hands on the gun and ready to fire. I bust the door open with my shoulder and was ready to see what I only assumed was some sort of beast. But then, as I opened the door, everything was quiet. I looked around and saw nothing. The woods, I could hear what sounded like something sprinting in the leaves. With that same skip-a-step rhythm that I had mentioned earlier. My dad opened his door and looked at me. He kept asking me if something was wrong. Do we need to go see a doctor? I kept refusing, and I told him the same story over and over, but I got the same answer from him every time. But whatever he thinks, I know what I saw, and I know that it's true. To this day, I've never hunted in that patch again. Around that same area, a man in our hunting club hunted in that same patch, and after that, he said he saw a deer from a nightmare, and then a week later he died from a heart attack. I will never look at that land the same again. I don't know what I saw, but I definitely never want to encounter it. Ever again. So this all happened way back in the late 1990s when I was a college sophomore. I and the girl I was dating at the time had been going steady for about 8 months, and since she was the first real girlfriend I ever had, my mom was keen to meet her, and what better time than the holidays to introduce her to the folks. During the week before Christmas, my mom's family traditionally held quite a large gathering up at my uncle's place over in Sandy, in my home state of Oregon. Pretty much all my extended family heads out there year after year from all over the Portland area, and since they had gotten word that I was bringing my girlfriend, they were hyped to meet her. I will not lie, I was kind of nervous that they would kind of embarrass me in front of her, but that anxiety was totally misplaced. She got on well with all of them, and despite some playful humiliation when a cousin of mine told her the story of how I literally peed my pants at the Haunted Mansion ride when I was a kid, they were a credit to me. And when it came to driving her back home, she seemed to be more into me than ever. We had agreed to drive back down to Eugene at like 7 p.m., so I would not be too tired driving back. But since we had such a good time, we stayed way later than we had planned, and did not get on the road until like 10:30 that night. In the hopes of making the journey just a little bit faster, I ended up taking the OR 211 instead of just sticking to the I-5 south for the whole drive. Annoyingly, this did not actually make the journey any faster, but the point being, the OR 211 was pretty much surrounded by farms and these huge swaths of dense pine forest. So as you can imagine, big stretches of it are not lit very well, and for some parts of the drive, we were moving through complete darkness, saved only by our car's headlights. But honestly, I was not too terribly worried about it. I was good at reading a map, and once I was back on the I-5, a road I knew well, I figured everything would be all good. So we are just cruising along, in high spirits, talking about how goofy some of my family were, but generally, my girlfriend was singing their praises and telling me how she could not wait to meet them again. It is right around then that we hit a section of the highway that descends this big old hill, leading up to the bridge crossing over Deep Creek. There, the highway is sandwiched by some of the densest forest you are ever likely to see, and there is absolutely nothing lighting up the highway. So the only thing we can see from the front seat of the car is maybe 20 to 30 feet that our headlights are illuminating. You pretty much could not see absolutely anything else in that darkness. But like I said, we were in high spirits, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Right as the highway starts to level off, something darts across the front of us so fast and so suddenly that I barely miss smashing into it. I brake so hard that I almost give the pair of us whiplash. Then, when we are stopped, both I and my girlfriend are in a complete frenzy of, "Oh my god, did you see that? What the heck was that?" There are plenty of deer in that area of Oregon, plenty of coyotes too. But the thing that ran out in front of us was way too big to be a coyote, and something about the way it moved gave me a gut feeling that it was not a deer either. The shape was just too slender, almost like whatever was out there had moved on 2 legs, not 4. Now, next thing, and I know how completely dumb this sounds in retrospect, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided I wanted to investigate. So, and again this was so incredibly dumb, I turned the car like 90 degrees on the highway, so I could put our headlights into the woods. Yes, this could have caused a horrible accident if another car had come along the same time I was doing this. But I wasn't thinking straight at the time. You see, as a kid growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I had heard a lot of stories about Bigfoot and Sasquatch, and I'd be lying to say if they didn't capture my imagination. Now, I'm not saying that I had caught a glimpse of Gigantopithecus or anything. I know these stories are mostly, stories, but part of me just wanted to be sure. So like I said, I turned the car 90 degrees, turned on the high beams, and stepped out of the driver's side and onto the highway. I stare off into the trees for a minute or two, but I do not see a thing. Nothing is moving out there, and the whole scene was quiet as the grave. But as I'm looking, I get this gut feeling in the pit of my stomach and start to feel as though I've made a huge error of judgment. It was one of the most intense, terrifying feelings I've ever felt in my entire life. A feeling like I was being watched by something predatory. I know this is a huge cliche, and the whole "I felt like I was being watched" thing is such a tired old trope, but I really do not know any other better way to phrase it. My heart was pounding. The hairs on the back of my neck are standing on end. My guts just turned to ice. So without turning my back to the woods, where I expected the danger to come from, I started edging back towards the car. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, I practically jump out of my skin when I hear the car's horn let off one long, excruciating, extended blast. I mean, it scared me so bad I almost straight up soiled my pants, Haunted Mansion style. My first thought that my girlfriend has ended up leaning on the horn and was trying to climb over into the driver's seat for some reason, because she had done that once or twice before. But as I turn around, I can see that she is still on the passenger side, but that she is leaning over to push the horn. in what was evidently a frenzied attempt to get my attention. I run back and ask if she's okay, but she does not say a single word to me, just points to a spot about 50 feet away from where we were parked. I spin my head around to see what she is pointing at, and that is when I see it. What was, without a shadow of a doubt, the thing that would run in front of the car only a few minutes prior. It was lit up by the residual light of the high beams. What I saw was obviously a man, but he was covered in animal furs. What looked like a mishmash of deer skins, bear skins, and elk skins, and on his head, secured in a way I'm not even sure of, were these antlers. At the time, because of how close it was to the holidays, I remember the words reindeer man just kind of flashing through my head. Maybe in the naive hope that the dude was dressed that way with some misdirected festive spirit, but he certainly did not seem in any kind of festive spirit. Not in the least bit. Like I said, I could not see his eyes because of the weird kind of head covering he had on, but I could see his mouth, and at first, he looked kind of like he was giving a smile. But as I looked closer, I could see it was not a smile at all. This guy was just baring his teeth to us, the same way chimps would do as a warning. After that, he turned and walked off into the forest, never to be seen again. Obviously, right after that, I and my girlfriend just got the heck out of there and got back on the road towards I-5. It took us both a while to calm our nerves, but my girlfriend was particularly shaken up, and that is because she had seen something that I had not. And as we drove on, she explained exactly what that was. While I'd been staring off into the woods, looking for Sasquatch or whatever else, she had noticed him out of the peripheral of her vision. But she was basically frozen in fear for a moment or two as she watched him slowly walking towards me. Or rather, walking is not the right word. From how she described it, this guy was stalking, the way a hunter might stalk a deer. The way she puts it, she had to summon pretty much all of the courage to be able to lean over and honk the horn the way she did. Then, when the reindeer man had heard the honking, he had backed off a little. Before I saw him, and like I said, he kind of just froze in place before disappearing. I've done a fair amount of research when I got home. I've tried to do anything that I can to see if anybody has ever had run-ins with this guy or reindeer person, I don't know. But there was absolutely nothing online about it. There are plenty of crazy survivalist types out there in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm guessing he might have been one of those. But they tend to be open about their existence, and sometimes even advertise themselves as militiamen or whatever, whereas the reindeer man seemed like he was living completely off the grid. I do not live in Oregon anymore. I and my girlfriend during the encounter broke up at the end of college, but when we were still together, and I happened to be driving down towards Eugene, I always avoided that stretch of highway that I saw the reindeer man on. I have told this story a lot over the years, and some people honestly just think I'm making it up as a little campfire tale or something. But it's not a tale. It's not made up, and it's definitely not just intended to be some dumb spooky story. It is most definitely a warning to anyone traveling on that road at night. Because if my girlfriend was not there with me when he ran out in front of the car, if she were not there to spot him before he crept upon me, only to scare him off with a blast of the horn, I honestly might not be here to warn you guys. So please, this holiday season, drive careful, drive slowly, and do not stop for any reason on a dark, deserted stretch of highway.
About 11 years ago, I was 16, and me and my friend used to always go down to the train yard and graffiti the trains. And my art was horrible, but I was young and dumb. While we were painting, we heard this diesel-powered train coming too, and no lights on or anything. We could only see it from the moonlight. I thought it was really weird. We were sitting on top of a train car, watching for about 15 minutes for someone to get out, and no one did. So we decided to leave. When we heard these loud cars coming, we knew something wasn't right, so we stayed and watched. 3 cars pulled in, a black SUV and 2 black Lamborghinis. The people that got out were wearing all black with sweatshirts, and it wasn't even cold out. We knew we were not supposed to be there. The 6 people were very tall, I would say 6'5" or higher, and not one of them talked. They had their hoods up, but all of them had bright blonde hair, which I thought was weird. They walked over to the train car and opened the door, which is when 2 people jumped out. And we thought we were witnessing human trafficking or something. When the people got out, they all stood in a circle, staring at each other like they all knew each other. My friend then whispered, "Vampires." I said, "Let's call the cops, this isn't good," and he said, "No, I'm not being caught up in the middle of this." I realized something isn't right. These people are not human. The way they moved, the way they presented themselves, it seemed like they had talked to each other through their minds. My stomach was seriously turning. They ended up speeding off in their cars. The train yard was next to the highway, and you could see them driving away very fast. We ended up getting down from the train car and looking to see what was inside the train car they had gotten out of. It was completely empty. We got out of there as fast as we could. I said to my friend that we should never talk about this again. Do not say anything to anyone. This happened around 12 at night. My friend's dad ended up picking us up at this diner because we couldn't drive yet. On the ride home, my friend told his dad everything. I was pissed. After he told the story, his dad said, "Why were you down there?" Like he knew something. He told us to never go down there again. A few years after this happened, I was watching a show called Ancient Aliens, and they were talking about this group of aliens called the Pleiadians. I realized that they looked just like what we saw. Just the other day, I and my friend were hanging out, and I brought the story up. He got so defensive and said, "I'm not talking about this." I never told anyone except my wife about this story, but I feel now is the time that I can't keep it quiet anymore. Whatever we saw was not normal. Whether it was vampires, aliens, or just some weird cult, we were not supposed to see this. I love your videos. Keep up the awesome work.
I recently found your show and thought I would share an experience that happened to me a few years back that I absolutely cannot explain. Just in case anyone has any ideas or if anyone has had something similar happen to them, it is pretty much the only thing of this nature that has ever happened to me before. It was evening on Christmas Day, 2012. I am around 16 or 17 years old, and my mom and I are driving back after spending Christmas Day with our extended family in Greater London. I and my mom lived alone with our dog Pika. We are just chatting away about Christmas, then the conversation moved to Santa Claus, and then we both started talking about how other mythical holiday characters, such as the Easter Bunny and Tooth Fairy. We talked for a while about how when I was younger my mom used to keep my baby teeth in a small jar with a blue fairy on top. Remarkably, like this one I grew up with, and I always remembered this jar from my childhood, but had not seen it for many years. I remembered that last time I had seen it, it was partially wrapped in a black duct tape, obviously due to it falling. And if I had to estimate when this was, I would say probably several years before, probably around the time we were moving to a new house and we were packing. Maybe around 2007. We spoke for a while about baby teeth in this jar. My mom also stated that she had not seen it in a long time and hoped it was not lost due to the process of us moving. I remember even saying that I thought it was a bit gross that my mom had kept all my teeth in the first place and that they are just sitting in the house somewhere rotting away. Anyway, this conversation went on for a while and then moved on to talking about other things. We arrived home shortly after, walked in the front door, and were greeted by my dog. As usual, My mom walks into the kitchen and I follow immediately behind her. And there on the floor of the kitchen is that small jar, opened in 2 pieces, and all these tiny baby teeth all over the floor. My first reaction was to think that my mom was trying to spook me, although she has literally never tried to play a prank on me in my entire life. But when I saw her face, I realized she was not playing a game. She immediately freaks out and starts ringing everyone she knows to tell them about what happened. My dog Pika was old at this point, maybe 11 or 12 years old, and was very docile. When we would leave the house, she would literally never go rummaging through belongings or anything like that. It would not really be possible anyway, as most of the stuff is kept in drawers or cupboards that she could not access. This is weird. I still do not have an explanation for it. My mom has a fair few unexplained, weird stories about things happening, and I just never thought they were real. And ever since this happened, I am now a believer. I grew up in a small town, the type where people did not really lock their doors. At least they did not used to. When I was about 14, I got called to babysit for one of my regulars who had 3 daughters. It was December, so a lot of Christmas work parties were going on. I arrived and we went over the usual rules. She mentions the TV upstairs was broken, so once I put the girls to bed, just head down there to watch TV. So after playing with the girls for a while, I sent them off to bed and headed downstairs. I spent a few hours channel surfing. It was about 1:30 a.m. I remember grabbing the phone though. I cannot remember who I was calling. Maybe it was my mom or my sister to let them know I would be late. But I heard the door open upstairs, which sort of surprised me. The mother who employed me enjoyed the nights I babysat, as she knew I was a night owl who could be there super late until around 3 in the morning, provided she held the cab for me. It was a small town, but I live on the other side of it. As I headed upstairs, I heard someone stumble, so I picked up my pace to make sure she was okay, only to find 3 people I have never seen before. There was a clearly drunk woman lying in the doorway and 2 guys. The guys looked surprised to see me, as I was them. I asked why they were there. The girl had slurred that they were there for the party. I was confused and asked if they knew who Helen was, who was the mother. One of the guys looked me up and down and I began getting very uncomfortable at the entire situation. He asked if I was alone, and I remember not wanting to answer because all I could think about was the fact that these 3 people were very dangerous to the little girls that were sleeping in the house. I decided, instead of answering him, I would simply state there was no party here and that they needed to leave. The girl admitted that she was here for the party. The guy who had asked me the question took a step forward. I demanded that this time they leave, and we all heard a phone button being pushed. I had forgotten it was in my hand, and it seems to be enough to startle the guy, who then thought I pushed it on purpose. The guy quickly told the other guy they were leaving and helped the woman up. As soon as they were outside, I slammed the door and locked it, and quickly ran to the front window and watched them. They continued up the block, so it was not merely messing up the house numbers for them. The mom returned home about 2 hours later and was confused about the door being locked. She was too drunk, so I just told her it made me feel safe. I feel stupid for not telling someone, but they did not really do anything at the end of the day.